Late in the evening of September 19, the year 2000, in the city of Chongqing, a woman named Quan Hongye headed to meet her boyfriend, struggling to carry the large bag in her hand. Unbeknownst to the woman as she made her way through the city streets, she was being followed by a large number of plainclothes police officers intent on arresting her boyfriend Zhang Jun, who they believed would be armed and extremely dangerous. The boyfriend Zhang Jun was suspected of being the head of a criminal gang that 18 days earlier committed a shockingly violent armed robbery in the Hunan city of Changde, which left multiple people either dead or wounded. At around 9:30 on the morning of September 1st, a crowd gathered to watch police searching an overgrown piece of wasteland along the banks of the Chongliu River. Earlier that morning, local man Zhang Rulin rode his bike towards a taxi cab apparently abandoned on the small dirt road the locals used to get to their plots of land to farm. It was fairly unusual to see a vehicle such as this on the small road. He'd noticed the car the previous day, and curious as to why it was still there, he approached it to take a closer look. When he saw the car the day before, on noticing him, the four men occupying the taxi rudely and aggressively told Zhang Rulin to get lost. Not wanting any trouble, Zhang Rulin backed away and put the incident out of his mind, but now what appeared to be the same vehicle was still there, and the four men were nowhere to be seen. Assuming the vehicle was stolen, he decided to take a closer look, and noticed what appeared to be blood on the car's interior. When police arrived at the scene after being called, they quickly confirmed the presence of blood on both the seats and the windows. The owner of the taxi was then tracked down through the vehicle's license plate registration. Arriving at the scene, the woman to whom the taxi was registered informed police that both she and her brother used the car for work, and the last time she'd spoken to him he mentioned accepting a long-distance fare the previous day. Using the spare key to open the trunk for officers, she almost fainted when greeted with the sight of her brother's body. As police began the preliminary examination, they discovered a knife hidden under the legs of the victim. However, the sister explained that her brother kept the weapon under the driver's seat for self-defense. Taking a closer look at the body, officers noticed what appeared to be a gunshot wound to the head, which looked like it was fired at point-blank range. When the forensic examination team arrived and began looking over the vehicle, other officers started searching the surrounding area. They quickly noticed what appeared to be spots of dried blood on the weeds of the waste ground leading to the river. Following the blood trail, investigators came upon a recently disturbed patch of earth, around 100 meters from the abandoned vehicle. Police asked the locals who'd congregated to watch the entertainment on offer to bring them some farming tools so they could start excavating the disturbed patch of earth, which was just under 2 meters long and about a meter wide. With the borrowed hoes and shovels, police, with help from some of the locals, carefully began moving the soil, and soon uncovered another body. The male victim was naked and already in a state of decomposition, but police were still able to note 2 gunshots to the head and 1 to the back. Investigators continued to search the surrounding area and spotted another slightly larger patch of earth, disturbed in the same manner. Removing the earth uncovered 2 more bodies buried together. One belonged to a half-naked male victim, the other that of a female. Both bodies were partially decomposed and had their hands and feet bound. Both victims appeared to have suffered gunshot wounds to the head, the male victim receiving 2, and the female victim just 1. The female victim was buried still wearing expensive-looking jewelry, and with a handbag containing cash and bank cards. The male victim's wallet was still in his trousers, the cash and bank cards still inside, suggesting to police that this was more than a robbery. Along with the cash and bank cards, both victims had other forms of identification buried with them, allowing police to quickly identify the deceased couple. The female victim was named as Zhang Jun, and the male victim was identified as Hu Menglian, the president of the Agricultural Bank of China, in Anxiang County, 80 kilometers to the north of Changde. They were husband and wife at the time of their deaths. They had both been reported missing 15 days prior to the discovery of their bodies. The mystery naked man, according to the level of decomposition, had been buried around a similar time, and the taxi driver had been dead only a few hours. The police now had the task of investigating the deaths of 4 people, and given the bodies were discovered in the same area, what connection the victims had with each other, if any. But in a matter of hours the city of Changde would be thrown into a state of chaos and experience the most violent day in the modern history of the city. At 6 o'clock in the early evening, a cash transport truck pulled up outside a branch of the Agricultural Bank of China in the Changde district Wuling. It was the last collection of the day for the armed escort team, who already had over 2 million yuan, around 240,000 USD in the vehicle. Driving onto the pavement outside the bank, 2 of the armed officers stepped out and stood guard, while the driver stayed in the vehicle. Inside the bank, a cashier and the bank's security officer picked up a strong box containing receipts and cash deposits for the day's business, which amounted to over 300,000 yuan, around 36,000 USD. Minutes after parking outside the bank, 3 armed men wearing hats and masks approached the vehicle, instantly opening fire on the guards. The 2 men outside the truck, Xiao Weidong and Wang Jianguo, were hit in the head, the bullets piercing through their helmets, and died almost instantly. The driver Zhang Jun was struck by a bullet to the neck before he had any time to react. One of the armed men then began collecting the submachine guns carried by the security detail, while the others headed into the bank, firing on the stunned staff members inside. Bank security officer Wang Pingtou was hit several times and quickly died from his injuries. The men then pointed their weapons at trainee cashier Li Jing, who was holding the deposit box. The men demanded he hand over the box and keys to the vehicle, but he refused. The gang opened fire, hitting him 4 times, ending his life. One of the men took the key for the truck from the fallen staff member, while another grabbed the deposit box, as terrified staff members cowered behind the cashier's desk. As the gang turned to leave, one of the cashiers took the opportunity to hit the bank's alarm. Hearing the alarm blaring, the gang knew they had little time before police would be on the scene, and a crowd was gathering outside the bank, potentially blocking their escape route. At the same time, in a taxi parked outside the bank, a 4th armed man exited the vehicle after firing on the driver Liu Hui, hitting him once in the head, ending his life instantly before dragging the body out of the car. As this was happening, the man who'd taken the keys was struggling to find the right one to open the cash truck. Eventually, one of the keys snapped in the lock as he tried to force it to open the door. Among the ever-increasing crowd of onlookers was military veteran Tang Chunqing. He galvanized people around him, and a group of them started to approach the armed men in efforts to stop them escaping the scene. The gang noticed the people moving towards them and fired in their direction. His old soldier's instinct kicked in, and Tang Chunqing dropped to the ground, taking cover in a guest house doorway, shouting for others to do the same. Unfortunately, 50-year-old Chen Yijun reacted too slowly and was hit 4 times, being severely wounded. Police sirens could now be heard approaching the scene, and the gang decided they had to give up on the truck. Taking the deposit box and the weapons, they piled into the taxi, driving away at high speed, forcing onlookers to jump out of the way. Rather than take the main roads to escape, the gang drove the taxi down a narrow alleyway and swiftly made their way through the maze of the city's back streets. Turning down one side street, the taxi was forced to brake sharply when Meng Qingzhong, riding his bicycle home from work, rode out in front of them. The car almost hitting him, he stopped to give the driver some harsh words. In response, one of the gang leaned out of the passenger side window and fired at the man, fatally wounding him. Continuing on, the vehicle came to a stop down another street, after crashing into 3-year-old Han Xi, while the young boy played in the usually quiet road. As the taxi backed up to get around the injured child, witness to the incident Wang Guoliang stepped forward in an effort to prevent the taxi leaving the scene. Angrily scolding the driver, he leaned towards the window and received a bullet to the face. Somehow he would miraculously survive the incident. Fishmonger Yao Bihua, who saw all this happen, was also fired on, being hit in the leg, forcing him to take cover behind his stall before the men drove away. The taxi weaved through the back streets without further incident, eventually coming to a stop close to Ganlu Temple, which neighbored the bus station on Renmi Road. By pure chance, Chen Laozheng, friend of the deceased taxi driver Liu Hui, was out walking around the area when the car stopped. Recognizing the taxi's license plate, he approached expecting to greet his friend. Instead, he saw the four men taking off masks and overalls they were wearing over their clothes. Noticing the man watching them, they told him in no uncertain terms to get lost, otherwise he'd be a dead man, but allowed Chen Laozheng to walk away with his life. The men then exited the vehicle carrying bags and satchels, abandoning the taxi, and taking off on foot in different directions. As the gang had been making their escape, only 4 minutes after the bank's alarm went off, the emergency services arrived at the chaotic scene, ambulances struggling to get past the large crowd that was gathered and blocking the road. Not yet knowing if the wounded bank staff and security detail were dead or alive, police didn't waste time checking for vital signs. With help from onlookers, they carried the men through the crowd of people to waiting ambulances, in the hope that their lives could be saved. However, the efforts would be in vain. The incident had left 7 dead, 5 wounded and 4 heavily armed, very dangerous men on the loose in the city. The police called in the military, and Changde was quickly placed into lockdown. By 7:20 in the evening, all roads and transport hubs around the city shut down in an effort to prevent anyone leaving without first being checked by the police or military. When reports of the incident got through to the provincial capital Changsha, more armed police were sent to the city with consignments of body armor, which the Changde police force severely lacked. The Hunan provincial government then sent out further military units to set up roadblocks on all routes out of the province. As investigation of the crime scene was ongoing, along with the massive province-wide manhunt, a special task force convened to go over the day's shocking events. Given the amount of carnage that had just taken place that evening, it was almost easy to forget that the day began with the gruesome discovery of 4 bodies on the banks of the Changde River. That took the day's body count up to 11, and police found it hard to believe that it was just coincidence. One of the corpses found that morning had been the president of a branch of the Agricultural Bank of China in Anxiang, and just hours after the discovery, another branch of the same banking organization had been the target of an armed robbery. The connection between the 2 incidents would later be confirmed when ballistic reports stated the bullets in both cases were fired from the same weapons. In the meantime, police were taking statements from witnesses of the bank robbery and the gang's chaotic escape. Investigators got basic descriptions of the men's faces, along with their physical characteristics. People who'd heard the men speak said they sounded like they had a northeastern accent. However, police treated this with a certain amount of skepticism. Given the escape route they chose, police believed the suspects had to be very familiar with the local area, unlikely native to Changde. As the task force worked on a plan to track the gang down, the case would quickly become a cross-provincial investigation when they were contacted by police in Chongqing. When word of the incident reached the police in Chongqing, it seemed to bear hallmarks of various armed robberies that had taken place in the city over the past 5 years. Crucially, investigators in Chongqing had images of some of the suspects in their cases, taken from surveillance cameras in days prior to the robberies. As with the bodies by the river, the connection between the Changde and Chongqing cases was confirmed with ballistic reports on the bullets fired. Over the next 2 weeks, the investigation saw police track down and arrest numerous members of a criminal gang responsible for multiple violent crimes in various provinces, causing the deaths of at least 28 people over the last 7 years. And the head of his own criminal empire was the man who'd become infamous for being one of the most notorious criminals in modern China, Zhang Jun. Born August 5, 1966, and native to Anxiang County, Zhang Jun had an interesting and fairly unusual entry into the world, with his father biting through his umbilical cord after leaving his mother's womb. His mother was a widow, struggling to cope raising her 3 daughters in the extreme poverty-afflicting rural farming communities during the 1950s and 60s. The single mother was introduced to a man 2 years her junior. Despite the man having a reputation for being lazy and happy to live off handouts from others, with few options, she married him. Soon after the wedding, a 4th child would be added to the family, another daughter. However, the man wanted a son to carry on his family name, and soon enough the mother of Zhang Jun became pregnant with him. On the evening of August 5, 1996, she went into labor, and like many people living in villages at the time, the family didn't have the means to go to hospital to give birth. She delivered the child at home with other villagers who lacked any formal medical knowledge, but had prior experience, acting as midwives during the delivery. Once his son came into the world, the villager overseeing the birth told the father to cut the child's umbilical cord. Unable to find a knife, the man simply placed some cloth over it, before biting through the cord. The father's actions would earn his newborn son the nickname Yao Qi, translating to biting the umbilicus. The young Zhang Jun wouldn't have an actual name for much of his early childhood, family and friends calling him either Yao Qi or Xiao Zhang, the character Xiao meaning small or young, together with his family name Zhang, a common way Chinese people refer to friends and relatives. As a child, Xiao Zhang recognized his family was poor, even in comparison to other families in the village. When invited to other villagers' homes for celebrations, he saw how they had better clothes and more food than them. When he asked why this was the case, his father explained that he'd grown up in a poor family himself, and it was difficult for people like them to escape their living conditions. The young Xiao Zhang, unsatisfied with the answer, became determined to break the cycle of poverty he was born into. Xiao Zhang finally received an official name when he began attending primary school. Needing a name to enroll, his father christened him Zhang Yunxi. The newly monikered Zhang Yunxi showed early promise in his education, frequently being one of the top performers among his peers. But the name his father gave him unexpectedly began causing him problems. A new teacher began working at the school, who coincidentally had the exact same name. The young students quickly realized they could use this to have a little fun at the teacher's expense. With his family being so poor, the young Zhang Yunxi had sometimes been the target of name-calling and bullying. However, now there was a teacher with the same name. The kids could openly insult him, while claiming they were talking about their classmate to avoid punishment. Over time, the young Zhang Yunxi began feeling his teacher namesake blamed him for his perceived loss of authority and was taking his frustrations out on him. He complained to one of his older sisters that the teacher was making him "穿小鞋," a Chinese idiom meaning wear small shoes. The idiom 穿小鞋 means to make life difficult for someone, as if the person is trying to walk in shoes that are too small for their feet, thus making the movements painful and slow. The sister suggested that changing his name could help the situation, and gave him the name Zhang Jun. The character Jun means army or soldier, and while he used the name for a time and it seemed to help, he began to dislike it. He felt he had bigger ambitions than being a soldier, and saw himself doing greater things, so once again his name would change, but this time he chose it himself. The new character he chose would have the same total pronunciation, but a very different meaning. This time the Jun character having the much loftier meaning of monarch or sovereign. Years later, after his arrest, with him having such a grand name, leaving multiple people dead across 6 provinces, and stealing millions, the media would declare him China's king of crime. Police in Changde investigating the violent armed robbery quickly released descriptions they had of the suspects to the public, along with the images police in Chongqing had on file. A handsome reward was offered for any information leading to an arrest. Since then the phone lines opened up for tips had not stopped ringing. Between the 1st and 3rd of September, police received around 10,000 lines of inquiry, and investigators were following up on as many as they could. One of the more promising leads came from a young man with a long criminal record for petty thefts, but also a history of helping police when it benefited him. Hoping to get his hands on the reward, he told police about 4 men he recently overheard talking in an Anxiang County hotel. The hotel was in reality a brothel and gambling den. He'd gone there for a massage and noticed the men drinking heavily and gambling with large sums of money. Asking friends who the men were, he was told about rumors of a big robbery they committed in Guangxi province, 500 kilometers to the south of Changde, and that some of them were ex-military. He was advised it was best not to ask too many questions about them, as they were serious people. What really interested police was when the young man told them the owner of the hotel had recently been in conflict with Hu Menglian, one of the bodies found buried the morning of the robbery. The story was that Hu Menglian was a regular visitor to the hotel and friendly with the boss. Trying to take advantage of the relationship, the hotel owner asked the bank president for a loan to help him renovate his business, but was flatly rejected. Being refused the loan supposedly angered the hotel owner, and possibly had him looking for revenge. Since witnesses said they heard the men talking with a northeastern accent, police asked their informant about this, but the young man was positive the men he'd seen were local to Hunan. Another promising tip came from a receptionist at a Changde hotel. She told police that towards the end of August 4 men who matched the physical description of the suspects rented a room there. The men registered with identity cards stating they came from Liaoning, a northeastern province 2,000 kilometers away, and spoke with northeastern accents. They said they were in the area on business, but they never left the hotel room the entire length of their stay, apart from one of the men who went out to get takeaway food. Interviewing staff members, police were told that a local man came to the hotel to pick them up when they checked out, and appeared to be quite friendly and familiar with them. They didn't know the man's name, only knowing him by the nickname the Fatman. This wasn't just because he was somewhat stocky, but also because he ran a nearby restaurant and karaoke bar called 胖子快餐厅, meaning the fat restaurant. With this information, investigators were quickly able to identify the Fatman as Li Jisheng. Police ran background checks while he was placed under surveillance, investigators concerned that arresting him straight away could potentially alert other suspects to the progress in the case, causing them to leave the area if they were still around. Investigators soon discovered that Li Jisheng was a former soldier who'd seen brief combat during China's failed attempt to invade Vietnam in 1979. Further investigation uncovered that the Fatman was good friends with a man whose wife worked at the bank targeted by the gang, making him appear a solid suspect. While the restaurant did good business, it was largely managed by his wife, Li Jisheng preferring to work as an unlicensed taxi driver, which obviously made him very familiar with the roads and shortcuts around the city. At the same time as the Fatman's movements were being watched, police in Anxiang were looking into the connection between Hu Menglian and the hotel owner. When police looked through phone records, they discovered the hotel owner had been the last person to call the bank president on the day he went missing, but the call went unanswered. Being questioned, the hotel owner admitted falling out with Hu Menglian over the loan refusal, but went on to say the two had known each other for many years, serving in the military together, and he made the call attempting to resolve the dispute. Asked about the four men, he said despite them using Liaoning identity cards to register, some were local to Anxiang, and only knew them by the nicknames Chen Qiang, Liu Baiwan, Li Zong, and Zhao Jingli. For the time being, police chose to believe the hotel owner's story. The deceased bank president had received an answered call from another number not long before the hotel owner attempted to call him, so they set about trying to track down the person who made that call. Meanwhile, in Changde more leads were coming in, giving police another potential name to hunt down. A female hotel worker told police that the description and images of one of the men resembled an ex-boyfriend she dated for a while. She gave his name as Chen Qiang, who claimed to be a businessman but was always extremely vague about how he made his money. He broke up with her after she introduced him to a friend of hers named Chen Le, the businessman deciding to dump the woman, preferring her friend. During her time with Chen Qiang, she'd been introduced to some of his friends, whom she said matched the descriptions of the other suspects. However, the men never referred to each other by real names, only nicknames. Along with Chen Qiang, she gave police the names Liu Baiwan, meaning Liu Millions, Li Zong, meaning Manager Li, and Zhao Jingli, meaning General Manager Zhao. The names matching those mentioned by the Anxiang hotel owner. Again, not wanting to potentially alert the suspects to the progress of the investigation, police went to speak to the sister of Chen Le and her husband before detaining and questioning the person of interest. Opening the door to investigators, the sister immediately asked if they were looking for Chen Qiang. The sister had long been suspicious of the man. Chen Qiang and Chen Le lived with them for a time, and while Chen Qiang clearly had money, he was always evasive about the business he did. During his time in her home, they frequently received phone calls from friends of Chen Qiang. However, he'd never speak on the home phone himself, instead going into a different room and calling the person back on his own phone. The callers never gave their real names, referring to themselves as Liu Baiwan, Li Zong, and Zhao Jingli, confirming to police that these were the men they were looking for. The brother-in-law of Chen Le added that when she and Chen Qiang first moved into their home, Chen Qiang brought a large safe which took 4 men to carry up to the apartment. When he asked Chen Qiang what was inside, he was told it was just important equipment for his business. When they heard of the robbery at the bank, they both immediately suspected Chen Qiang could be responsible, but didn't want to report their suspicions due to concerns about Chen Le. They added that Chen Qiang recently purchased his own apartment, and he and Chen Le had moved out. They gave police the address, and Chen Le was placed under surveillance, police hoping the man known as Chen Qiang would turn up there. The following years of the young newly named Zhang Jun would be the most impactful of his life. His performance in school saw him gain entry into a better primary school where he'd become friends with 2 people who'd play significant roles in his future, boy Chen Shiqing and girl Xiao Yuele. As with Zhang Jun, Chen Shiqing grew up in a poor family, this despite his father having a good education and working as an accountant for a time. However, his father was also a strict, violent man who often beat Chen Shiqing if his performance in school failed to meet his expectations or the young boy did anything the man didn't like. The 2 boys' fathers had something in common, namely being what is known as Dao Cha Men, meaning reverse door son-in-law. Typically, the Chinese family setup would see the woman marry into the man's family, where she'd hold the role of homemaker, taking care of the children, the man's parents and the home. Dao Cha Men referred to times when the man married into the woman's family, and the traditional roles were reversed, the husband taking on the tasks usually expected of the wife. The term, especially in the past, carried with it a negative connotation, and while being a relatively rare phenomenon at the time, it was viewed as being emasculating for the men. The father of Chen Shiqing, much like that of Zhang Jun, married late by Chinese standards, unable to find a wife until he was over 30. Both men were reverse door son-in-laws, and while the father of Zhang Jun didn't have an issue with that, the father of Chen Shiqing did. Once his son was born, due to him marrying into his wife's family, the boy was given the family name Chen, rather than his own family name of Xie. Sons were more prized than daughters, in part due to the next generation of males carrying on the family name. With his son not having his family name, the father of Chen Shiqing was a disappointment to his own family, and this mixed with the feelings of inadequacy from being a Dao Cha Men son-in-law caused an anger to fester inside him. During his childhood, while playing with other kids in the village, Chen Shiqing was often asked why he and his father had different family names. The young Chen Shiqing had no idea, so asked his father about it. Feeling humiliated about his son's question, instead of answering, he beat Chen Shiqing, telling him to never bring it up again. From then on and throughout the rest of his childhood, the father of Chen Shiqing frequently took his anger out on his son with violent beatings, considering the boy a constant reminder of his failure to be a real man. His upbringing turned Chen Shiqing into something of a fighter, and after meeting Zhang Jun, the 2 young boys bonded over a love of martial arts, training together to improve their ability to fight. Zhang Jun continued to perform well in his education, but while in middle school his life took a dramatic turn. His mother was diagnosed with uterine cancer, and the family had no way to afford treatment for the disease. The 12-year-old boy could do little more than watch his mother slowly and agonizingly waste away. In an effort to do something that could ease her pain, Zhang Jun asked what he could do to help her. His mother told him the one wish she had was to eat a bowl of simple meatball soup. Such was the level of poverty at the time. For most rural families, even the most basic meat was a rare luxury, something they'd be lucky to get once every few months, or when celebrating festivals. But determined to do something that could bring his mother some happiness, Zhang Jun went out into the streets every day after school, collecting trash and selling it to scrap dealers. Eventually he managed to scrape together enough to buy a small piece of pork. He prepared the dish himself and saw his mother smile for the first time in many months as she ate, but the young boy's experience made him believe living in poverty was a death sentence. His mother eventually passed away, and there was a notable change in the young Zhang Jun. While previously, when teased by other kids for being poor, he responded by hurling insults, now he replied with his fists, his friend Chen Shiqing backing him up. The other important figure in his life at this time, female classmate Xiao Yuele, noticed the change in Zhang Jun more than most. As the two matured, she'd begun to have romantic feelings towards him, and he appeared to feel the same way. When his mother died, she tried her best to comfort him, having the experience of losing a parent, her own mother dying when she was very young. However, he reacted either coldly or angrily towards her, rejecting her offer of comfort, then putting distance between them. The tragedy he suffered didn't affect his studies, and he continued to perform well inside school. Outside school, however, he was a different person. He began to gain the reputation in the local area as a troublemaker, getting into fights on a regular basis, often picking them himself. Moving on to high school, Zhang Jun believed attending university was the best way to help him escape poverty, but that would change when the family was hit by more problems. Never the hardest working of men, with the mother of Zhang Jun passing, his father tried to do what he could to provide for the family. That came to an end when he was struck down by severe health problems that left him unable to work, and relying on his teen son to take care of him. The older sisters of Zhang Jun had married and moved away to raise their own families, leaving him the eldest child at home, trying to juggle his education along with nursing his father. His ambition of getting into university seemed a distant dream, and he felt he couldn't wait that long, so made the decision to drop out of education. However, he wouldn't get a legitimate job. Looking around the local area, he noticed that the people who had money were those that didn't waste their time doing honest but back-breaking work. Instead, he took his first steps into the world that would later make his name one of the most notorious across the country. By the 5th of September, 4 days after the robbery, police in Changde had Li Jisheng and Chen Le under surveillance, but felt they soon had to make a move to arrest them. After interviewing friends of Chen Le, police had managed to get a solid lead on the name of a third suspect. When police knocked on the door of the woman named Luo Li, she asked if they were there to question her about Chen Le and the robbery. She explained that once the descriptions of the suspects in the robbery were made public, she immediately felt they sounded like the new boyfriend of Chen Le and his friends, whom she'd previously been introduced to. After hearing about the robbery, she'd called Chen Le to check she was okay, and joked about boyfriend Chen Qiang being responsible. The nervous reaction of Chen Le gave Luo Li the impression her suspicions were correct, but didn't want to report them to police, concerned about her friend's safety. Like others who'd given statements about Chen Qiang and his friends, she only knew the nicknames the men used to refer to each other. She went on to tell police the man known as Zhao Jingli talked a lot and liked to boast. He claimed he lived in Yiyang, a city 100 kilometers to the south of Changde, where he ran an illegal massage parlor. He told Luo Li that the women who worked for him earned good money, and that if she struggled to find decent-paying jobs in Changde, she should come work for him in Yiyang. The investigation team contacted their counterparts in Yiyang to help track down the man known as Zhao Jingli. The police in Yiyang went out raiding massage parlors across the city, detaining and interviewing staff members. Since the businesses were little more than brothels, which were illegal, but to which authorities turned a blind eye, police made it clear they were only interested in finding Zhao Jingli to get people to talk. A staff member at one brothel mentioned a security guard who had the family name Zhao, who'd suddenly quit the job after boasting about coming into a large sum of money. He couldn't recall the man's full name, only remembering people called him Hongbao, meaning red envelope, what Chinese people used to gift lucky money during various festivals and celebrations. Police were familiar with the manager of that particular brothel, and easily tracked him down. They asked about the former security guard, and the brothel manager gave police the name Zhao Zhenghong. With 3 names linked to the robbery, police decided they couldn't wait around much longer. It was more than likely the gang would soon be aware police were onto them, if they weren't already, and would attempt to go into hiding. They had both Chen Le and the fatman Li Jisheng under surveillance, and an address for Zhao Zhenghong, so set about arresting the suspects. From residential registration records, investigators discovered Zhao Zhenghong lived with his wife and children. Believing he'd likely be armed and prepared to resist arrest, police asked the massage parlor boss to help lure him out. Knowing he didn't have a choice, the former employer of Zhao Zhenghong agreed and called him, inviting him to come check out a new massage parlor that had recently opened in the area. It took a little convincing, Zhao Zhenghong seemingly a touch concerned about going out in public, but eventually the massage parlor boss, perhaps because he worked in an illegal industry, managed to get the former security guard to trust him. A large team of armed plainclothes police stationed themselves at the agreed meeting place, nervously anticipating making the arrest. Almost as soon as the massage parlor boss pulled up at the location, Zhao Zhenghong jogged towards the car. As he went to open the door, the arrest team pounced and quickly got him under control, stripping him down to his underwear to ensure he was unarmed. Only moments later, back in Changde, the team keeping tabs on the fatman Li Jinsheng got the go-ahead to arrest him. Li Jinsheng was entertaining friends as officers entered the restaurant firearms drawn, and took the shocked Li Jinsheng into custody. Around the same time, police watching the apartment where Chen Le resided with Chen Qiang stormed the building to arrest the young woman and hopefully the man. There was no sign of her mystery boyfriend, but Chen Le later took police to another apartment Chen Qiang used, and there it quickly became clear they needed to track him down as soon as possible. Investigators had been unaware of the second apartment, but Chen Le had a key. A heavily armed team escorted her to the property, in case Chen Qiang was hiding out there. The apartment was sparsely decorated, and contained only the most basic furniture, but the search soon uncovered a number of hand pistols, 2 submachine guns, 16 shotguns, custom-made suppressors, and 1,300 rounds of ammunition. On originally being given the name Chen Qiang, investigations into the identity led police to believe it was fake, and they found evidence to support this in the apartment. Along with the arsenal of weapons, there were multiple fake identity cards for various people. Police also found a collection of newspaper clippings about numerous robberies that had taken place across the country over the last decade. Investigators also found the safe the brother-in-law of Chen Le had spoken of. They asked the young woman for the combination, but she claimed she was never told it. Bringing someone in to cut the safe open, police found it contained hand grenades, fake police uniforms, bank cards with names matching some of the fake identity cards, and over 400,000 yuan, a little under 50,000 USD in cash. Being questioned while in custody, the trio of Li Jinsheng, Zhao Zhenghong, and Chen Le gave little to help police track down the remaining members of the gang. Chen Le claimed she didn't know the true identity of her boyfriend Chen Qiang, and the two men initially refused to answer questions. However, investigators got more information from friends of Zhao Zhenghong, and were given the name Li Zejun as a close associate who police suspected would likely be the man known as Li Zong or Manager Li. Police got an address for Li Zejun, and an armed arrest team headed to the location, hoping the suspect had yet to leave the city. After knocking on the door of the apartment, it was answered by a woman who was quickly moved out of the way, as officers stormed the room. Li Zejun was quickly and aggressively brought under control, his hands bound behind his back with his own belt. Any attempts to claim innocence would have been pointless, after a preliminary search of the property turned up more hand pistols, shotguns, and false identity cards. With the news of Li Zejun being arrested and continued intensive interrogations, police began to get answers. Chen Le had nothing much to offer, seemingly being told little about the gang's activities, and being somewhat overwhelmed by the events of the day. And when speaking to Zhao Zhenghong and Li Jinsheng, it soon became clear the gang had a hierarchy. Both men were lower-ranked members, and as such the information they had was limited. They didn't know the real names of other gang members or addresses they used. They could only confess to the crimes in which they participated and give the nicknames of those they worked alongside. Li Zejun, on the other hand, was second in the gang's chain of command, being a member for the longest period of time and taking part in the most robberies. He had much more information to offer investigators, and since evidence was found in his apartment, knowing he was facing the death penalty, he told police everything he knew. He gave the names of as many people he knew, and most crucially the identities of the third in command, Liu Baiwan as Chen Shiqing, and the leader of the gang, Chen Qiang, as his uncle Zhang Jun. He confessed that the four men who committed the bank robbery were himself, Zhang Jun, Chen Shiqing, and Zhao Zhenghong. News of the arrests had by now made the local and national media, and as a result both Chen Shiqing and Zhang Jun were undoubtedly aware the police were getting close to them, so would be attempting to go into hiding. Given the number of false identity cards already discovered, it was obvious the two men would have more, and was pointless for police to try and track them through registration records. Instead, they had to try and find the other names given to them by Li Zejun, believing the two fugitives would turn to other gang members for help. Their top priority was a woman. During the search of the second apartment Chen Le took police to, and the discovery of numerous false identity cards, it was found that one woman in particular, who wasn't Chen Le, had multiple cards made for her. It appeared that the woman held some importance to Zhang Jun, so investigators asked Li Zejun to identify her. He informed police that she was the wife of Zhang Jun, with whom he had a child. However, Zhang Jun was very protective towards her, and even his closest lieutenant wasn't trusted with her real name, Li Zejun only knowing her with the name Juanzi. Apart from this, he only knew she lived in Chongqing, and apparently had an uncle or brother who worked for the police. With this, Changde investigators believed Zhang Jun would likely head to Chongqing, and contacted their counterparts in the city, warning them to be on the lookout for him, while they got on with the task of hunting the rest of the gang. Friends since their elementary school days, both Zhang Jun and Chen Shiqing left education early, Zhang Jun during high school, and Chen Shiqing partway through middle school. Initially their lives took very different paths until meeting again years later. After leaving school, Chen Shiqing began learning a trade, becoming a local bricklayer's apprentice, from which he'd move on to doing masonry work. Even at a young age he found some success, earning a good reputation in the area, and taking on 10 apprentices of his own, when still only in his early 20s. Zhang Jun, on the other hand, took his first steps into the criminal underworld, but started small, joining a gang causing trouble around the county. The gang had 13 members, and named themselves the 13 Taibao. The moniker a reference to the 13 sons of warlord and founding member of the later Tang dynasty, Li Keyong, who served as envoys and warriors. The gang quickly became notorious in Anxiang, as they spent their time getting into fights, gambling, and committing acts of petty theft. Although Zhang Jun was the youngest member of the gang at 17 years old, his fighting ability and comparatively higher level of education earned him a lot of respect from the older members, and they frequently followed his plans. However, in 1983 the government announced a Yanda, or Strike Hard campaign nationwide. Strike Hard campaigns instructed police forces across the country to crack down on all criminal activity, and mass arrests took place, those caught up in the crackdown being paraded through the streets and subjected to public show trials and sentencing. People tired of the gang's activities reported the 13 Taibao to the police, and all gang members were subsequently jailed. The campaign took place a few months prior to the 18th birthday of Zhang Jun. Therefore, at 17 years of age he was still considered a juvenile when police arrested him. While the other members of the gang received long sentences in adult prisons, Zhang Jun was sentenced to 3 years in a young offenders detention center. He spent his time incarcerated keeping a low profile, attending classes, reading, and began writing letters to the girl with whom he was previously close to, Xiao Yueye. She was attending high school at the time and still had feelings for him, so she wrote back and the two communicated regularly throughout his time locked up. After completing his sentence and being released, one of the first things he did was visit her. The two soon started a relationship, Zhang Jun asking Xiao Yue'e to marry him shortly after. She eagerly accepted his proposal, but her father was less than pleased, knowing the reputation of his potential future son-in-law. He told his daughter Zhang Jun wasn't trustworthy, and she could do much better. She was a high school graduate and possibly going on to attend vocational college, while he was a former convict with few prospects for the future. Zhang Jun defended himself, saying he hated his time in the detention center and had no intention of going back. He needed to take care of his father, whose health issues had worsened significantly in his time away, and that he was determined to live an honest life. Xiao Yue'e ignored her father's warnings and chose to believe Zhang Jun. The young couple married and she moved into his family home. Early signs were promising. Zhang Jun worked the fields to earn money, while Xiao Yue'e stayed home helping to take care of her father-in-law, performing the expected housewife's duties. The couple went on to have 2 sons, and Zhang Jun decided he needed to do more than the long hours of back-breaking work for little financial reward. He began harboring ambitions of starting his own business, but to be able to do so he needed financial capital, which he didn't have. However, he managed to get in touch with an old school friend of his named Xu Jun. The father of Xu Jun worked in the credit department of the local branch of the Agricultural Bank of China, so Zhang Jun approached his old acquaintance to ask for help with obtaining a loan. With assistance from his father, Xu Jun managed to get a loan of 2,000 yuan, a little over $240, and handed the money to Zhang Jun. The loan was a considerable amount for the time period, and more money than Zhang Jun had ever seen in his life thus far. It allowed him to rent a storefront in Changde, from which he and Xiao Yue'e sold leather footwear. The business actually started promisingly, Xiao Yue'e managing the store, while Zhang Jun went out visiting suppliers and making deals. They were making a decent living, but having full pockets for the first time in his life. Zhang Jun began enjoying the fruits of his labor in the wrong manner, falling back into old habits. While Xiao Yue'e was running the store, taking care of their children and her father-in-law, Zhang Jun was out associating with members of society's underbelly, gambling, drinking, and visiting brothels. The money the business was bringing in couldn't keep up with his spending, and Xiao Yue'e soon figured out what Zhang Jun was doing with it. In early 1991, the father of Zhang Jun succumbed to his illness and passed away. Zhang Jun was out gambling at the time, missing his father's final moments, leaving his wife to deal with it. At first, Xiao Yue'e, like many women married with children at the time, turned a blind eye to her husband's gambling and womanizing. Being a divorced woman with 2 children in rural China was a tough position to be in. But once they were forced to close the store, she couldn't ignore it any longer. When confronting him about his behavior, she was viciously beaten in response. Living with a violent, abusive husband who was wasting all their money gambling and womanizing became too much for Xiao Yue'e, and consequently she attempted to end her own life by drinking pesticide. Fortunately, she survived the attempt, and once she recovered, her family took her back to their home village, along with the 2 children. Perhaps not wanting to be confronted by a furious father who never trusted him and had been proven right advising his daughter to stay away from him, Zhang Jun left the area. However, the family found themselves being troubled by the man who gave Zhang Jun the 2,000 yuan loan. Repayment with interest was due, and Xu Jun was having difficulty tracking down Zhang Jun. He went looking to the family of Xiao Yue'e to cover the debt, but after hearing the story he accepted it wasn't her responsibility and for the time being wrote it off, but remembered Zhang Jun owed him when the two met again years later. Zhang Jun had taken to working on a boat transporting goods along the Xiaoshui River, which flowed through the county. While he helped out as a deckhand, the main reason he was offered the job was to help fend off bandits that often attempted to hijack boats in the area. The owner of the boat was familiar with the reputation of Zhang Jun from his days in the 13th Haibao, and knew he was useful in a fight. And it'd be while working on the boat, Zhang Jun overheard the owner talking to others, making him party to a conversation that kicked off his criminal career. The boat's owner was talking about 2 sisters who were making real money running a business on one of the wharfs along the river. The sisters had invested in a factory on the island province Hainan and asked the ship owner if he'd also like to invest and partner with them, saying they needed to raise 100,000 yuan, around 12,000 USD, an almost unimaginable amount at the time. Both the ship owner and his brother turned the sisters down, believing two women were unlikely to find success in business. However, they were proven to be wrong. The sisters found other people to invest, and since then the business thrived. On hearing the words 100,000 yuan, Zhang Jun had already formulated in his mind what he was going to do. His only previous attempt at a robbery, apart from mugging people with the old gang, hadn't been successful. Shortly after his shoe store closed, he tried to rob a convenience store armed with a knife. The weapon wasn't enough to stop the store owner fighting back, and Zhang Jun was forced to flee with nothing more than a pack of cigarettes. He believed that if the store owner was prepared to fight him off for what was probably only a few hundred yuan, then people would certainly fight back to protect thousands. He decided he needed more than just a knife. He looked into getting hold of a firearm. Once fairly commonplace in rural areas, government drives, including the Strike Hard campaigns of 1983 and 1986, had seen many firearms confiscated, making them much harder to get hold of. Once again he turned to a former school friend. This time the man was working as an armed guard at a detention center in Guangzhou, so Zhang Jun made the trip south to pay his old friend a visit. Knowing he didn't have a reasonable excuse for his friend to just hand a weapon to him, he went there only to ask for ammunition. He made up a lie about needing the gunpowder for a village doctor to use as ingredients for a traditional Chinese medicine to treat a family member who was seriously ill. It took some convincing, but eventually the old school friend handed Zhang Jun 30 rounds of ammunition. Returning to Anxiang, he set about getting hold of a firearm. Using contacts from time spent in gambling dens, he was given the name of a local metal worker who was known to make them. He had 2 firearms made which worked with the ammunition he had. He then got in touch with an inmate he knew from his time in the detention center to assist him in the robbery. Liu Baogang was someone he got on well with during their time incarcerated together. He'd shown himself to be a loyal friend and was physically strong. Zhang Jun only intended to use the firearms to scare his targets and stop them from trying to fight him off. He viewed Liu Baogang as someone who could help get his targets under control. Hearing the plan and potential rewards, Liu Baogang agreed to join Zhang Jun without needing much in the way of convincing, and on April 20, 1993, the two men approached the residence of the two sisters. Almost immediately the plan went wrong. Adrenaline pumping and unfamiliar with handling firearms, Zhang Jun fired as soon as one of the sisters opened the door. The woman was hit in the shoulder and fell to the floor screaming. The noise brought the second sister to the doorway, and Zhang Jun fired again without really aiming, hitting the woman. Surprised by the noise of the firearm and having the two women screaming and shouting for help, Zhang Jun decided he needed to abort the robbery before people came to see what was happening. He fired one more shot towards the floor, hoping to shut the women up, but the bullet ricocheted, striking Liu Baogang in the leg. Zhang Jun picked his injured partner off the ground, helping him hobble away from the scene before witnesses arrived. The duo slowly moved along the banks of the river, hearing voices shouting behind them. Eventually Zhang Jun reached a point where he couldn't keep helping the much larger man walk, and had to let him down to the ground. Moaning in pain, Liu Baogang begged Zhang Jun to take him to a doctor. Looking down at the injured Liu Baogang, knowing that taking him to a hospital would almost guarantee they'd be arrested, Zhang Jun made a choice that saw him cross an event horizon. Pulling a hammer he'd brought to use during the robbery from his belt, he bludgeoned the injured man about the head. The attack left Liu Baogang unconscious, but wanting to make sure his partner was dead, Zhang Jun smothered him to finish the job. He then dragged the lifeless corpse of Liu Baogang down to the river and dumped the body in the water. For the first time Zhang Jun had taken someone's life, and just like his belief about living in poverty being a death sentence, he was now facing another, so he decided there was no point holding back anymore. The investigation into the Changde robbery was now being undertaken by two police forces across different provinces. The Changde police were interrogating the suspects already in custody and hunting other members of the gang. At the same time, the Chongqing police were out in force attempting to find the woman known as Juanzi, and the gang's leader Zhang Jun. In Changde, both Zhao Zhenghong and Li Zejun gave police details of other robberies in which they'd participated, and names of people who were also previously gang members, or assisted them in other ways. Li Zejun gave police information about 2 men who'd participated in violent incidents that left people dead, but who later left the gang. The first was a man with the name Wang Yu, who'd taken part in a 1998 Hubei province shooting, which left 2 people dead, 1 a police officer. Zhang Jun later jettisoning him from the gang for being too timid during the incident. The second man he only knew with the nickname Yinjiang, meaning silversmith. He'd been involved in several robberies, but later left the gang, Li Zejun unsure if he quit or was kicked out. Wang Yu was tracked down fairly quickly. He was living in the area, and since he'd been kicked out of the gang 2 years earlier and played no part in the Changde robbery, he never expected police to come looking for him. Being questioned, he admitted the man known as Yin Jiang was in fact his brother-in-law Yan Ruoming, and told investigators where they could find him. Yan Ruoming, like Wang Yu, felt he was far enough removed from the gang that the police wouldn't connect him to the incident, and made no attempt to flee the city after news of the robbery broke. While much of the investigation thus far had focused on the bank robbery and the carnage left in its wake, investigators still hadn't forgotten about the 4 bodies found by the river that morning. Now, with several of the gang in custody, and Li Zejun in particular giving them information, police pressed for answers. He confessed the bank president and his wife had their lives ended at the hands of himself, Zhang Jun, Chen Shiqing, and Zhao Zhenghong. The job was given to them by another man who wasn't a member of the gang, naming the individual as Xu Jun, an old school friend of Zhang Jun. Xu Jun soon found himself detained with the other men, and there were more arrests to come. Along with the names of the men, investigators were surprised to be given the names of 3 more women, who'd all played active roles in the gang's activities. The women, along with Chen Le and the as yet unidentified Zhenzi, were all romantically involved with Zhang Jun, and described as his mistresses. Living up to his name Jun, meaning monarch, Zhang Jun put together his own harem of concubines, just like the emperors of old Chinese dynasties did in the past. Chen Le was the most recent addition, and Zhang Jun marrying Zhenzi suggested she was his favorite. The names of the 3 remaining women were Qin Zhibi, Quan Hongyan, and Yan Min, who all lived in Chongqing. Once they received the names, the Chongqing police started searching for the women, and were still attempting to find the woman known as Zhenzi. Despite having little information about her, it was enough to put them on the right track. They scoured through the records of marriages and births, cross-referencing the names against those with relatives in the city's police, soon coming across the name Yang Mingye. The marriage certificate showed she'd married a man supposedly named Long Haili, but the man pictured next to her was in reality the wanted Zhang Jun. Hoping Zhang Jun would come to see her, police placed Yang Mingye under surveillance. But on September 18, she was spotted leaving her apartment carrying a large suitcase, looking like she was leaving town. Without waiting to see where she was headed, police arrested her, taking her into custody for interrogation. She claimed she'd never heard of the name Zhang Jun, and that her husband's name was Long Haili, who was just a businessman. She went on to plead ignorance about any of the criminal activity. However, she'd eventually admit the truth and told police Zhang Jun called her a few days earlier, asking her to prepare some items for him and sell their car. While police searched the apartment, the phone was called several times, investigators believing the call was being made by Zhang Jun, checking to see why Yang Mingyan didn't turn up to meet him. There was the hope that since Yang Mingyan held some importance to him, Zhang Jun may come to the apartment himself, so a surveillance team was placed outside while officers got on with searching the room. As with the property in Changde, the search uncovered multiple firearms, more false identity cards, hand grenades, body armor, and a large amount of cash. An investigation team from Changde had arrived in Chongqing to assist their counterparts, and believed the Chongqing team jumped the gun with arresting Yang Mingye, thinking she would have led them to Zhang Jun. Fortunately, the other women living in Chongqing had also been found and placed under surveillance, their phone calls being monitored. Police were able to determine that Zhang Jun contacted Quan Hongyan after the calls to Yang Mingye went unanswered. In the evening of September 19th, Quan Hongyan was spotted leaving her apartment carrying a large bag. This time the police were patient and followed her to an area around the city's surgical hospital. She stopped at a narrow side street running alongside the hospital and was almost immediately approached by a man nervously glancing around the area. They exchanged some brief words before the man took the bag from her. The surveillance team pounced as Quan Hongyan began walking away, the man being the priority. As the plainclothes officers went to grab him, the man moved his hand towards his left armpit. Officers quickly got control of him and took him down to the ground. As some officers twisted the suspect's arms behind his back, others removed his shoes and socks. Police had been told Zhang Jun had an identifying mole on the sole of his left foot. Removing his socks, they saw the man on the floor had a mole, making the officers certain they had the right person. Standing the suspect up, they searched him and found he was armed with a Type 54 pistol, standard issue for the Chinese armed forces. Searching the bag brought by Quan Hongyan, they found more pistols, over 100 rounds of ammunition, a hand grenade, and cash. As they pushed him towards a waiting police car, the only thing Zhang Jun said was that he was surprised they were so quick, not giving him a chance to end his own life. Quan Hongyan was also stopped and taken into custody a little away from the scene, and before being taken to the police station, she was returned to her apartment, where investigators found yet more firearms and cash stashed away. News of the capture of Zhang Jun spread quickly, and the media, likely tipped off by the Chongqing police to publicize their success, descended on the police station he was taken to for interrogation, arriving almost simultaneously. With such a high-profile suspect, the deputy director of the Public Security Bureau in Chongqing, Wen Qiang, came to the station to confront Zhang Jun personally, putting himself front and center of the case. While the Changde team had done the majority of the heavy lifting in the investigation, the top man had been caught in Chongqing, and Wen Qiang was happy to take credit for getting Zhang Jun off the streets, making sure cameras were there to publicize his interrogation, and proudly boasting Zhang Jun fell at his feet. As the interrogations of the gang went on, the scale of their activities became clear. Since 1994, Zhang Jun and the people under him collectively committed numerous armed robberies and various other crimes, leaving at least 28 people dead and multiple people seriously injured. However, despite the celebratory mood after the capture of Zhang Jun, the investigation wasn't over. One gang member remained at large. The police still hadn't tracked down number 3 in the organization, Chen Shiqing. Police found the body of Liu Baogang floating in the river weeks after his life was ended by Zhang Jun. The two sisters they'd attempted to rob survived the attack, coming away from the incident with relatively minor injuries. With the discovery of the body, the investigation essentially came to a close. Since nothing was taken, and both sisters recovered from their injuries, the local police kept it on file, but put little effort into finding the second suspect. Zhang Jun left the area in the aftermath of the failed robbery, and went to the county-level city Jin, visiting distant cousin, Yan Ruoming. The married Yan Ruoming worked as a blacksmith and planned to head south to Fujian province, finding work in the city of Quanzhou. He didn't have a close relationship with Zhang Jun, coming from a different side of the family which didn't visit their Anxiang relatives often. Keen to leave the area, thinking police were still looking for him, Zhang Jun decided to tag along with his cousin, finding work in a quarry in Quanzhou. He soon grew tired of the hard physical labor and decided to quit, but had no desire to return to Anxiang. Instead, he stayed in Fujian, heading to the provincial capital Fuzhou, leaving Yan Ruoming in Quanzhou. He briefly looked for work, but finding nothing other than more physical labor, he began committing petty acts of theft to earn money. He'd force his way into rooms at the small cheap hotels he was staying, taking whatever cash or valuables he found left in the room while the occupants were out. These robberies rarely got him more than a few hundred yuan, enough to cover his basic living costs, but he still had larger ambitions than that. In one hotel he met a businessman who clearly had more money than his usual targets, so Zhang Jun attempted to rob him with a knife in the man's hotel room. However, the businessman fought back, using the room's furniture to force his armed assailant to retreat empty-handed. With his tail between his legs, Zhang Jun decided he needed to get his hands on a real firearm. After the incident with the sisters, he blamed the homemade nature of the weapons rather than his own inexperience handling firearms for them injuring the sisters. Consequently, he believed having the genuine article would lead to more success. He knew areas of the country which bordered Vietnam were places where firearms were trafficked, so left Fujian and made his way to Guangxi province, stopping in Chongzuo city, close to the China-Vietnam border. He crossed over the border into Vietnam illegally, and ended up in the northern city Lang Son, but soon ran into trouble when passing a military base. He'd been loitering outside for a while, pondering the unrealistic idea of attempting to join the Vietnamese army to get a firearm, but his presence was spotted by 2 guards of the base. The guards aimed their weapons at Zhang Jun, shouting at him in their own language. Unable to understand what they were saying, Zhang Jun tried to use body language to communicate, but when that failed he resorted to speaking Mandarin. On hearing him speaking Chinese, the guards took him into custody, thinking he could be a spy. Zhang Jun found himself locked up in a Vietnamese jail cell, until an interpreter was found so he could try to explain what he was doing in the country. Zhang Jun claimed he entered the country by mistake, saying he got lost while visiting friends and accidentally crossed the border. The Vietnamese authorities were skeptical about the story, but decided the best way to deal with the situation was to hand him back to the Chinese border police. As nervous as he was during his time as a Chinese man in the Vietnamese jail cell, he was more nervous when it was decided he wasn't a spy and was taken back to the border. Unsure if he was wanted for the attempted robbery of the sisters and subsequent homicide of Liu Baogang, he thought there was a chance he'd next find himself in a Chinese jail cell. The police held him in detention for a few days and questioned him about what he was doing in Vietnam, but eventually released him and allowed him to return to Chongzuo. Returning to the city, Zhang Jun was still determined to get a firearm, but he had no idea where to look, nor the money to afford one. He took on a job working in another quarry, which would allow him to get to know people more familiar with the area, and perhaps new people who could help him get what he wanted. He was eventually introduced to a dealer, but on seeing the goods on offer, he wasn't impressed. The seller only had German World War II pistols, which Zhang Jun viewed as being too old and therefore unreliable, little different from the homemade pistols he'd previously used. Not wanting to lose a customer, the dealer promised if he could be patient he'd be able to get a Type 54 pistol, but informed Zhang Jun it would be costly. As he waited, Zhang Jun spent his free time wandering aimlessly around the city, and stumbled upon a small military surplus store. Needing a decent pair of boots for work at the quarry, he went inside and was surprised to hear the elderly store owner speak with a Hubei accent. With his home province Hunan neighboring Hubei, Zhang Jun could speak with a passable Hubei accent, and pretending to be a fellow native of Hubei, he soon struck up a friendship with the store owner Yan Wangcai. In early February 1994, the Chinese New Year was approaching, and Yan Wangcai invited Zhang Jun to celebrate it with him. The old man didn't have any family in the area, and usually spent it alone. Zhang Jun accepted the invitation, and when the pair sat chatting the old man started talking about how good business had been recently. Having grown to trust Zhang Jun, he proudly displayed stacks of cash amounting to 6,000 yuan, a little over $700. On seeing the money, Zhang Jun suggested celebrating with some decent quality baijiu, the strong Chinese rice wine, and told Yan Wangcai he'd go and purchase a bottle. Along with the wine, he also bought a hammer, which he tucked away in the belt of his trousers, hiding it under his jacket. Yan Wangcai enjoyed the drink, perhaps a little too much. Zhang Jun made sure to respectfully fill the man's cup when empty, and the older man didn't notice Zhang Jun was drinking at a much slower pace. Once Yan Wangcai was sufficiently drunk, Zhang Jun took out the hammer and bludgeoned the old man to death, leaving the scene with his victim's 6,000 yuan. Despite now having the money to buy the Type 54 pistol, Zhang Jun chose not to seek out the dealer who promised the weapon. He wanted to put some distance between himself and the body of Yan Wangcai, and chose to get on a train, eventually making his way to Kaiyuan City in Yunnan Province. Kaiyuan was another city lying close to the China-Vietnam border, and as such had a reputation for having a strong black market economy for firearms. Zhang Jun got hold of a fake identity card and spent time enjoying the money stolen from Yanwangcai, gambling, or in dance halls. In one dance hall, where men went to meet women who acted as hostesses, sitting and drinking with them, and offering more services for the right price, Zhang Jun met Yanmi. Yanmi was native to what at the time was known as Fuling City, part of Sichuan province. She was married and had a young daughter. However, unhappy with her marriage, she and her husband were separated, which led to Yanmi leaving her hometown to look for work in Kaiyuan. Needing money to take care of her child, she ended up working in the dance hall as it offered more money than other jobs in the area. She spotted Zhang Jun sitting alone and approached him asking if he wanted to dance. The two began talking, Zhang Jun giving her his fake name, Jiangping. He told her he once held a position at a state-owned company, but had to leave after embezzling money to pay for medical treatment for his sick mother. Yanmin was touched by his story, so the two began seeing each other outside of the dance hall, and the relationship blossomed. Still living off the money stolen from Yanwangcai, Zhang Jun gave Yanmin the appearance of being a reasonably successful man. Knowing that many of the men who frequented the dance hall would likely be part of the local underworld, Zhang Jun asked her if she knew people who could sell him a firearm for self-defense. Through talking to other women she worked with, Yanmin was able to introduce Zhang Jun to the right people, leading him to eventually meet Na Po. Na Po had firearms to sell, but the price was far beyond the budget of Zhang Jun. Needing more money, he turned to Yanmin, knowing she'd saved a decent amount from her job. By this point, Yanmin had decided to divorce her husband and wanted to be with the man she knew as Jiangping. He told her he needed 10,000 yuan, $1,200 to purchase the weapon. She gave him the money, with the promise he'd pay it back with interest. Zhang Jun finally got his hands on a Type 54 pistol and 200 rounds of ammunition, with Na Po throwing in a bonus hand grenade. Zhang Jun wanted to waste little time testing how effective the weapon could be during robberies. He went to dance halls with Yanmi, allowing her to perform her hostess duties, while he carefully watched for big spenders. He quickly set his sights on what looked like a good target, and approached the man, striking up a conversation. He found out which hotel the businessman was staying, and the following day went to the man's room. On opening the door, the businessman found the pistol being pointed at his face. The masked Zhang Jun entered the room and demanded the man hand over all the money he had. Without hesitation or attempts to fight back, the businessman gave Zhang Jun over 10,000 yuan. Satisfied, Zhang Jun left with the money, allowing the man to live. Shortly after this, Yanmi returned to her hometown with the intention of getting divorced, leaving her free to marry Zhang Jun. Zhang Jun stayed in Kaiyuan and in her absence, enjoyed his ill-gotten gains, gambling and enjoying the company of dance hall women. In the October of 1994, he'd meet two escorts, Wang Qicui and Lu Wanlan, who seemed to always be together. They began spending a lot of time with Zhang Jun, getting him to take them to the most expensive restaurants and on extravagant shopping trips. However, when it came time to get into bed with them, the women always had an excuse to turn him away. Taking longer than it should, Zhang Jun came to the realization they were grifting him, playing him along to pay for their lifestyle without giving him what was promised. This infuriated Zhang Jun, and he decided the women needed to be punished. He convinced the two escorts to accompany him to a secluded area in the countryside surrounding the city with the promise of a meal at an expensive restaurant he'd been recommended. The women couldn't resist the offer of another free dinner and happily went along. As they walked along a remote country road, Zhang Jun, slightly behind the women, pulled out his pistol, telling Wang Qicui and Lu Wanlan to face him. He fired on the women, hitting both with fatal shots to the face. But after they fell to the floor dead, Zhang Jun fired a few more times to leave no room for doubt. Having taken 2 more lives, Zhang Jun decided it was time to leave the area, heading to Fuling and joining Yanmi. The couple moved to Chongqing, and Zhang Jun quickly saw the opportunities the city offered to make money. Chongqing had long been an important city in China. Its location along the Yangtze River saw it become the largest port in the southwestern region of the country. Once considered part of Sichuan province, Since the 1960s, it had been recognized as a provincial-level city, incorporating other various surrounding cities and counties under its control. Over the subsequent decades it continued to grow in size, eventually being named as one of 4 municipalities directly controlled by the central government, along with Beijing, Shanghai, and Tianjin in the northeast of the country. By 1994, the municipality had a population of over 28 million people, and massive amounts of money were pouring into developing the city. Changde, the home city of Zhang Jun, was tiny in comparison with its population of just 5 million. Zhang Jun spent his first 2 months in Chongqing exploring the city, learning the geography, getting familiar with the various streets and districts, seeing nothing but money all around him, and a massive population to hide among. On November 23, 1994, Zhang Jun spent the morning wandering around a farmer's market, watching the vendors do business. He'd already picked the area out as a good place for a robbery, with all the businesses only dealing in cash, and the location having little security. The markets did the bulk of their business in the early morning as people came to buy their fresh groceries for the day, and activity slowed down approaching lunchtime, with many of the stalls closing. One of the vendors, Wang Liming, stuffed his day's takings into his pockets, and closed his stall before heading to the nearby public toilet. He'd been spotted by Zhang Jun, who followed him inside. Before Wang Liming knew what was happening, Zhang Jun raised his pistol and fired, fatally hitting the vendor in the head. He emptied his victim's pockets, and walked away from the scene with just under 6,000 yuan, a little over $700. Returning home to Yanmin, who spent her days chatting and playing mahjong with the neighbors, Zhang Jun was disappointed. Previously 6,000 yuan was a fortune to him, but comparing it with the money floating around Chongqing, he now believed the risks he was taking weren't worth the reward, and he wanted more. Zhang Jun had his sights set on bigger targets, deciding he was going to rob a bank, pushing Yanmin to help him. Yanmin had long realized her boyfriend, who she still believed was called Jiang Ping, wasn't the businessman he claimed to be, and was now aware of what he did. In her confession years later, she claimed that once she found out how he made money she wanted to leave, but Zhang Jun said he'd never pay back the money she'd given him, and threatened to end the lives of her family if she disobeyed him. Feeling she had no choice, she agreed to help, and in participating gave Zhang Jun more control over her. Knowing that robbing the bank directly was risky, the plan was to steal from people withdrawing cash from their accounts once they left the bank. With massive development taking place in Chongqing, huge construction projects were going on across the city. With that came a large number of migrant workers, who were mostly paid in cash. This in turn would lead the managers of the construction companies needing to withdraw large sums of money to pay the workforce. The role of Yanmin in the scheme was to hang around inside the bank, watching the people withdrawing cash, then signaling to Zhang Jun when she spotted someone taking out a significant amount. Zhang Jun spent weeks looking for the right location, wanting to find a bank that received a decent amount of people, and offered numerous escape routes from the area. He eventually picked out a bank in the Yuzhong district, and on the morning of January 25, 1995, he and Yanmin walked into the bank separately. After around 30 minutes, Yanmin spotted a man withdrawing around 20,000 yuan, almost $2,500. She held up 2 fingers, signaling the amount to Zhang Jun, but after thinking about it he shook his head, deciding to wait for a bigger fish. A short time later, contractor Li Jiuchuan walked into the bank and proceeded to withdraw 50,000 yuan, $6,000. Yanmin signaled the number 5 with her hand, and Zhang Jun followed Li Jiuchuan outside. He waited until his target walked down the steps of a narrow quiet alleyway before tapping him on the shoulder. Once Li Jiuchuan was facing him, Zhang Jun fired, hitting the man in the stomach. Li Jiuchuan tried to run, but only made it a few steps before falling to the ground. Zhang Jun stood over him and hit him with 2 more bullets, took the man's wallet and hodl, then left the scene. In a public toilet, Zhang Jun emptied his victim's wallet and bag of all the cash, placing it into his own bag, then changed the side of the reversible jacket he was wearing, before re-entering the streets. Li Jiuchuan would initially survive the attack, but eventually died from the injuries he'd sustained, taking the victim count of Zhang Jun up to 6. Returning home to Yanmi, he placed the money on the table. It was more than either of them had seen in their combined lives. He handed her a stack of cash, telling her to go see her friends and play mahjong, to make everything seem normal. As she was about to walk out the door, he gave her a warning to never flaunt the money in front of others, potentially giving them away. Zhang Jun spent the next few days combing through newspapers, looking for information about the robbery and police progress in the case. From what he was reading, it appeared the police had no clues about the identity of the wanted man. Zhang Jun started a habit which he'd maintained throughout his criminal career, keeping clippings of the news reports about his crimes. Zhang Jun and Yanmi lived well off the stolen money for several months, but Zhang Jun wanted more, and was already thinking up plans for the next robbery. However, Chongqing was a massive city, and he came to believe he needed more safe houses to hide out and stash what he took, also wanting people to take care of the locations when he wasn't there. Zhang Jun had an appetite for female company, and began looking for another woman, preferably one that came with her own apartment to use as another safe house. Despite being in a relationship and living with Yanmin, he played around with a lot of other women, but felt that those of a younger age were more costly to take care of. So in 1995 he visited a dating agency with the goal of finding someone older. 27 years old at the time, he told the matchmaker he had few requirements and was just looking for someone older, adding that he wasn't concerned about the women either being divorced or having children. He'd fairly quickly be paired with the 43-year-old Qin Zhibi. Native to Chongqing, Qin Zhibi divorced the previous year, her ex-husband getting custody of their son, while she had custody of the daughter. She worked a number of part-time jobs in the city and had her own apartment. On meeting Zhang Jun, she was somewhat surprised and more than a little wary that someone so much younger would have an interest in her, but she was soon charmed by Zhang Jun and became his second mistress. Despite not being his usual type, Zhang Jun quickly grew to view her as a strong, capable woman, and felt she could be more useful to him than just providing an extra safe house, and it wouldn't take long for her to prove his instincts were correct. One day while shopping in one of the city's department stores, his eyes stopped on the area selling jewelry, and the gold in front of him. Qin Zhibi noticed what caught his attention, and started looking at what was on offer herself, lamenting the fact she couldn't afford any of the items. Seeing her disappointment, Zhang Jun told her he could get her every piece, if that was what she really wanted. Confused by what he meant, Zhang Jun made it clear once they returned to the apartment. He pulled out his pistol, telling her what he really did to make money. He went on to say he intended to rob the mall's jewelry counter, but needed her help. With no coercion, she agreed to taking part in the robbery, and on December 22nd they rode a motorcycle to the Overseas Chinese Friendship Mall in the city's district of Shapingba. Qin Zhibi was dressed in men's clothing, her long hair tucked away and hidden under a hat, giving her the appearance of being a man. The pair walked into the department store and straight to the jewelry counter. Zhang Jun immediately held up the Type 54 pistol, pointing it at the terrified staff. He fired, injuring one staff member before demanding the others get on the floor. The staff members followed his orders, and Zhang Jun stood over them handing out kicks to anyone whose eyes strayed from the ground, while Qin Zhibi began forcing open display cases with a chisel, filling bags with the gold and silver jewelry. As the robbery was taking place and terrified shoppers fled, a female cleaner, Bi Jianqing, saw what was happening and began shouting for help. Zhang Jun fired at the woman, hitting her 4 times, and she fell to the floor dead. Feeling his partner was moving too slowly, Zhang Jun took out another chisel to assist with opening the display cases and helped her grab items. After filling his bag, Zhang Jun shouted at Qin Zhibi, saying they needed to leave, but she was like a woman possessed, still grabbing as much as she could, forcing him to pull her away from the scene. As they got to the door, a security guard made an attempt to stop them. The guard blocked their path, and Zhang Jun raised his weapon, firing at the man, severely injuring him. The couple then went to where they left the motorcycle and sped away from the scene. Qin Zhibi drove as she was more familiar with the area, leaving Zhang Jun free to fire at anyone following them. They drove to a predetermined location, dumping the bike before changing their clothing and removing the hats they wore to obscure their faces. Grabbing the bags, they walked into the streets like a normal couple, with police looking for 2 male suspects. The robbery left 1 dead and 2 hurt, but the injured parties would go on to recover from their wounds. Qin Zhibi and Zhang Jun had gotten away with around 450,000 yuan, almost 53,000 USD worth of gold and silver jewelry. The decision to disguise Qin Zhibi as a man worked, as news reports said police were looking for 2 male suspects, rather than a man and woman, leaving him confident he'd gotten away with the crime. Zhang Jun had planned ahead about how best to deal with the goods. He had no intention of selling each item. Instead, he wanted someone to smelt the gold and silver. Knowing an individual who had experience working metals, his blacksmith cousin Yan Ruoming. He returned to Changde for the first time in 3 years and paid a visit to Yan Ruoming, showing him what he had. From the number of items displayed, it was obvious the jewelry was stolen, but Yan Ruoming agreed to help after being promised handsome payment for the work. He'd eventually sell the gold and silver for 300,000 yuan, a little over 36,000 USD, less than it was worth, but still a huge amount. When he returned to Chongqing, he handed Qin Zhibi 50,000 yuan for her help with the robbery, before heading to Fuling with Yan Min to lie low. In the February of 1996, he and Yan Min were enjoying an evening in a dance hall, when Zhang Jun spotted Yang Mingyan, immediately feeling strongly attracted to her. He left Yan Min sitting alone as he went to dance with Yang Mingyan. He introduced himself as Long Haili, saying he was a businessman from Shenzhen in Guangdong province, and the pair danced with each other as Yan Min watched them, seething with anger. Yang Mingyan was 23 years old when she met Zhang Jun. She'd recently quit her job at a printworks and opened her own small restaurant. Her brother was a police officer in Chongqing, and she was having an affair with an older man identified with the pseudonym Wang Mofu, a detective in the Chongqing police. Over the subsequent weeks, Zhang Jun took Yang Mingyan on extravagant shopping sprees, lavishing her with expensive gifts, all behind the back of Yan Min. Eventually, Detective Wang Mofu would get word of his young mistress having an affair of her own, and angered by this turned up at a hotel room she was sharing with Zhang Jun. Forcing the door open, the detective pulled his weapon on Zhang Jun, ordering him to stay away from Yang Mingyan. In response, Zhang Jun pulled out his own pistol and pointed it at Wang Mofu. Stuck in a tense standoff in which neither man had an advantage, they decided to discuss the issue between them and lowered their weapons. Fortunately for Zhang Jun, Wang Mofu was corrupt, often assisting criminals around the city, and they later went on to become good friends, Wang Mofu being one of the main sources for the many fake identity cards Zhang Jun used. He was free to start a serious relationship with Yang Mingyan, but when Yan Min discovered this, she marched to the restaurant owned by her now rival, and the pair got into a furious argument. Zhang Jun managed to calm the situation, telling the women he was prepared to provide for them both, but still turned to the other mistress, Qin Zhibi, for help. Qin Zhibi had no issues with her boyfriend having 2 other younger women, so Zhang Jun asked her to help mediate any conflicts that arose between Yan Min and Yang Mingyan, something she was willing to do to keep Zhang Jun happy. In the summer of 1996, Zhang Jun and Yang Mingyan received an official marriage certificate, Zhang Jun using the name Long Haili. He was helped by Detective Wang Mofu, who'd used his various corrupt connections to produce an official identity card and household registration certificate under the name Long Haili. The success he'd had in the last robbery made Zhang Jun thirsty for more, and while Qin Zhibi proved herself a reliable partner, he felt she was too slow. Zhang Jun believed he'd have even more success if he had another man working alongside him. Wanting someone he felt he could trust, he returned to Changde and once more paid a visit to his cousin Yan Ruoming. Up to this point in his life, Yan Ruoming had been an honest, hard-working family man. He was now making money selling and renting motorcycles, and while that was enough to make a living, life remained a struggle. When seeing Zhang Jun wearing expensive tailored clothes, paying for meals at the best restaurants, and seemingly having no worries about money, it was hard for Yan Ruoming not to feel a certain degree of envy. Zhang Jun told his cousin if he ever wanted to make real money, he should come visit him in Chongqing. But the family man Yan Ruoming was hesitant, he had a wife and kids to take care of, but from previously smelting the gold, he had an idea of how much Zhang Jun made. On December 20, 1996, Yan Ruoming took a bus to Chongqing and met up with Zhang Jun. Zhang Jun paid for a decent hotel room for his cousin to rest, and told him to spend the next few days walking around the city, familiarizing himself with the area. He also told Yan Ruoming to listen to how the locals spoke and work on imitating the local accent, something Zhang Jun could now do quite well, while they prepared to rob the jewelry department at another shopping mall. Yan Ruoming was nervous, but Zhang Jun reassured him that all he needed to do was force open the display cases and empty the trays into bags. 5 days after arriving in Chongqing, Yan Ruoming joined Zhang Jun in entering the jewelry department of the Chongqing branch of the Shanghai First Department Store. Approaching their target, Zhang Jun unholstered the pistol and shouted at the staff to get down. At the same time, Yan Ruoming pulled out a chisel and began making quick work of the display cases. The years Yan Ruoming spent working as a blacksmith came in handy, as he easily forced the cases open, grabbing as much as he could. Shoppers witnessing the robbery were stunned for a moment, unsure if what they were seeing was real. One witness ran to the exit shouting for help, but Zhang Jun fired and hit the man, severely injuring him. As shoppers fled into the streets shouting, the noise began to attract a crowd, and members of a group fairly unique to Chongqing, known as the Bangbang, meaning staff army. Much of Chongqing city was built on a mountainside, which resulted in steep hills for people to walk up. Carrying goods from the banks of the river could be a hard, arduous task, but created job opportunities, people migrating from the countryside to work as porters, manually transporting goods or people from the port using baskets tied to each end of a meter-long bamboo pole. Seeing the commotion outside the department store, a few members of the staff army released their baskets and headed to the scene armed with their poles. They confronted Zhang Jun and Yan Ruoming as they were trying to escape, but Zhang Jun didn't hesitate to use his own weapon, firing and injuring 2 more people. The shots caused onlookers to flee in panic, allowing Zhang Jun and Yan Ruoming to get to a motorcycle and make their getaway with goods worth 630,000 yuan, $76,000. After escaping, Zhang Jun ordered Yan Ruoming to check in to another hotel, handed him 10,000 yuan and told him to head back to Changde the following day, promising him more money when the time was right. The following month, Zhang Jun arrived in Changde and went to give Yan Ruoming another payment of 10,000 yuan. Yan Ruoming, while happy with the money, couldn't help feeling disappointed knowing it was only a small fraction of what they'd taken from the mall. While in Changde and catching up with old friends, Zhang Jun heard a name he hadn't given much thought to for several years, that of his wife and mother to his sons, Xiao Yueye. Unbeknownst to Zhang Jun, Xiao Yueye had filed for divorce in 1995, which she'd been granted in the absence of her husband. Despite not having given her a second thought for a number of years, and marrying another woman under a different name, the news she'd divorced him sent him into a fury, and he went to visit her. In the years since splitting from Zhang Jun, Xiao Yueye had spent most of her time doing factory work in Guangdong province, providing for her children who were being raised by her father. Seeing each other face to face, Zhang Jun demanded she not work in Guangdong, believing she would meet and marry another man. This didn't anger him because he still had feelings for her, but because he didn't want another man raising his sons, even though he showed no interest in doing so himself. Despite threats of violence he made towards her and her family, Xiao Yueye stood firm. Eventually Zhang Jun tried to give her money for the children, but she refused it, saying she never wanted to be in debt to him. Realizing she wasn't going to be intimidated, and that he no longer had power over her, Zhang Jun left Anxiang and made his way back to Chongqing, leaving 20,000 yuan, just under $2,500 at the home of his former father-in-law, with a note saying it was for his sons. On returning to Chongqing he decided to get back to work, but felt that after committing 3 major robberies in the city, he should perform the next one elsewhere. Following the police investigation into the last robbery in the media, he saw images of a possible suspect from security camera footage was made public. It was from the day before the robbery, however the images weren't clear, and they'd only captured Yan Ruoming, who was significantly taller than Zhang Jun, and no longer in the city. But still he didn't want to take too many chances, choosing the location of his next robbery as the provincial capital of Hunan, Changsha, and decided to add another member to the gang. Yan Ruoming had acquitted himself well during the last job, but prior to and post the incident, he showed himself to be incredibly anxious. Zhang Jun wanted someone with a little more nerve, and preferably someone comfortable handling firearms. Once again he turned to family, getting in contact with his nephew by virtue of being the son of a half-sister, Li Zejun. Li Zejun enlisted in the army after leaving school, and was posted to a naval base on the island province Hainan, serving as a gunner during his time there. After completing his service and being demobilized, he found work as a cook in a factory canteen, earning only 300 yuan, 36 USD a month. In the September of 1997, Zhang Jun invited Li Zejun to join him and Yan Ruoming for an evening out. Li Zejun hadn't seen his uncle for a number of years, but noted that he seemed to be doing well in life. Despite being related, Li Zejun and Yan Ruoming came from opposite sides of the family, making this the first time they met. Zhang Jun introduced Yan Ruoming with the nickname Yinjiang, meaning silversmith, and told his cousin not to give his real name to Li Zejun, who was introduced as Li Zong, meaning manager Li. It took little convincing by Zhang Jun to get his nephew to agree to joining the gang. They picked out their target location as the Changsha Friendship Mall, and spent the next few weeks planning and practicing for the job. Yan Ruoming and Li Zejun were told to walk around the area surrounding the mall, to get familiar with possible escape routes, and Zhang Jun bought display cases which both men practiced forcing open with chisels. Despite him having military experience, Zhang Jun wanted to see how his nephew performed under pressure before arming him, so Li Zejun was told to grab the jewelry with Yan Ruoming. On November 27, 1997, the three men got off the two motorcycles they'd prepared in advance, entered the mall, and quickly made their way to the jewelry counters. As soon as Zhang Jun raised the pistol and shouted for the staff to hit the floor, Yan Ruoming and Li Zejun got to work, forcing open display cases and filling their bags. Shoppers began screaming and fleeing the scene, attempting to raise the alarm. Salesman from another business, Wu Hao, stepped out of his store and tried to get a look at the masked gang. Zhang Jun spotted him and fired, hitting Wu Hao several times, ending his life. He then saw another employee, Yu Le, staring directly at him in shock. Zhang Jun fired, fatally wounding the young man. In the chaos that was now taking place after the shots, Zhang Jun fired and hit two more people, but they'd survive with relatively minor injuries. In little more than 2 minutes the robbery was over, leaving 2 dead and 2 injured. The gang left the mall and got to the motorcycles with items valued at 1.3 million yuan, almost 160,000 USD. Zhang Jun had promised Li Zejun an initial payment of 50,000 yuan and Yan Ruoming 60,000, 6,000, and 7,200 USD respectively, but when time came to get paid, they only received half. Zhang Jun told them he was fining them for errors made prior to the robbery. He asked Li Zejun to go to another city to buy the chisels used to open the display cases, but he'd rather lazily used a hardware store near the hotel where they were staying, potentially making it easier for police to start tracking them down. Yan Ruoming had been ordered to buy a second-hand motorcycle, but instead he'd bought a new bike, thinking it would be more reliable. However, being new, it didn't yet have a license plate, and the day before they intended to rob the store, Yan Ruoming had been stopped and questioned by police about the lack of the license plate, and had to show his identity card. Both men's actions had caused the robbery to be delayed by a week, costing Zhang Jun extra money. In the future, Zhang Jun expected more professionalism, and so punished his men with heavy fines. With each robbery being more successful than the last, Zhang Jun had no intention of stopping and looked to further add to the gang. Sometime in 1997, he headed back to Kaiyuan with Li Zejun to buy more firearms, wanting each member to be armed. Having no desire to carry a weapon himself, Yan Ruoming decided he was done with his criminal career. While the money had helped him significantly, he just couldn't handle the violence involved. Zhang Jun accepted his decision, but made it clear he'd end the life of Yan Ruoming and his family if he ever betrayed him. Needing a replacement, Zhang Jun got in contact with the brother-in-law of Yan Ruoming, Wang Yu. Wang Yu was another member of the extended family who'd served in the military, acting as an armed border guard. After leaving the military, he then worked as an armed police officer in Shenzhen for 3 years. He'd since quit the police and was working for a restaurant, dealing with suppliers. Zhang Jun got in contact, initially asking him if he could use his old police contacts and get him some fake identity cards with Guangdong province registration. Hesitant at first, Wang Yu eventually agreed to help once Zhang Jun mentioned how much he was willing to pay for his assistance with getting the cards, and slowly but surely Wang Yu would find himself getting pulled into the gang. At this time Zhang Jun was back in Chongqing, still maintaining relationships with Yan Min, Qin Zhibi and Yang Mingye. And he'd soon meet the woman who'd become the 4th member of what would later be referred to in media reports as his Pink Army. In the March of 1998, Zhang Jun hailed a taxi being driven by Quan Hongye. The life of Quan Hongye was not going to plan when she met Zhang Jun. She was a college graduate who'd found a decent paying job after leaving university. However, she'd been through a messy divorce and fired from her job soon after, so took to driving a taxi to earn a living. Immediately attracted to her, when she asked where he was heading, in response he told her to just drive around the city with him for a while. As she drove him around Chongqing, Zhang Jun talked about wanting to learn how to drive, and asked if she'd like to give him lessons, telling her she could keep the meter running and he'd pay whatever it came to for the class. She agreed, and over time they'd start a romantic relationship, Zhang Jun using her apartment as another safe house to hide his ever-growing arsenal of weapons and money from his robberies. The gang continued to expand throughout the year, although it would take time before some members actively participated. In the April of 1998, Zhang Jun was back in Changde and for the first time was introduced to the fatman, Li Jisheng. Zhang Jun had been spending more time in Changde, looking to meet women who could provide him with potential safe houses as he intended to commit more robberies outside Chongqing. The two men were introduced through an acquaintance who used Li Jisheng as a reliable unlicensed taxi. When in the military, Li Jisheng had been a combat driver. After leaving, he'd begun driving taxis, eventually making enough money to open his restaurant, which had karaoke rooms on the 2nd floor. The two men got to know each other after Li Jisheng agreed to drive Zhang Jun from Changde to the Hubei province city Yichang, a 250-kilometer trip. One reason his businesses had done fairly well was down to Li Jisheng being a friendly man who loved to talk. However, on the long drive north, he got the impression his fare wasn't in the mood to chat, so stayed quiet. Reaching the destination, Zhang Jun handed him 800 yuan, 96 USD, far more than Li Jisheng was going to charge. Before getting out of the car, Zhang Jun asked Li Jisheng about his time in the military. After listening to his story, Zhang Jun took his contact details, saying that he always needed reliable men and might have work for him in the future. The next person to appear on his radar was Zhao Zhenghong, a woman Zhang Jun was dating in Changde, introducing them to each other. Zhao Zhenghong left education after primary school and began working at his parents' fruit stall in a local marketplace. Regretting the fact he was uneducated, he often looked to get rich quick ploys, but had recently been conned by an illegal pyramid scheme, losing most of his life savings. The two men met at an expensive dinner Zhang Jun was hosting for the friends of the woman he was dating in Changde, passing himself off as an affluent businessman selling electrical appliances. Zhao Zhenghong was working as a security guard when being invited to the dinner, and Zhang Jun began talking about how he was always looking for good people to help keep his business secure. Seeing Zhang Jun was a person with money and sniffing out possible job opportunities, Zhao Zhenghong did what he could to impress. His efforts bore fruit, Zhang Jun telling Zhao Zhenghong he would likely have work for him in the future. Zhang Jun spent time considering who was to join him in his next robbery from the people he'd started to bring into his sphere of influence. Li Zejun had military experience, handled himself well in Changsha, and was keen to make more money. Li Jisheng was another with a military background and had seen active combat, meaning he'd likely be good under pressure and comfortable handling firearms. Wang Yu had served in both the army and police force, but his hesitation in getting the fake identity cards had Zhang Jun questioning if he was up to it. Zhao Zhenghong was an unknown quantity, however he desperately needed money, and therefore was potentially easy to manipulate. Zhang Jun decided to seek out one more person, and see if he'd be interested in joining the gang, his old trusted classmate Chen Shiqing. Chen Shiqing had given up on masonry work in 1995, finding it increasingly difficult to make money in Anxiang, so he started selling motorcycles in Changde. This too proved to be not as financially rewarding as he would have liked, so he took to driving a taxi around the city. While friends of his viewed him as a solid, reliable family man, many of his issues with money came from his enjoyment of gambling. When the two men met for the first time in many years, Zhang Jun was surprised how little effort it took to convince Chen Shiqing to join him. Owing people money, Chen Shiqing had been planning to turn to crime to pay off gambling debts. Rumors had been swirling around the area about how Zhang Jun was making money and that he was fairly wealthy, so Chen Shiqing wanted to do the same. Zhang Jun told his old school friend what he'd been doing over the past few years, confirming the rumors, and placed his pistol on the table. In response, Chen Shiqing told him to wait a minute, and went into another room, coming back with a shotgun he recently purchased with plans to use it in a robbery of his own. Chen Shiqing had the single ambition to get 1 million yuan, and gave himself the nickname Chen Bai Wan, meaning 10 millions. Hearing this, Zhang Jun laughed, but advised him to use an alternative family name to help better hide his identity, and gave him the name Liu Bai Wan. Zhang Jun now wanted to put some of his men to the test, and picked Li Zejun, Chen Shiqing, and Zhao Zhenghong as the team he felt had the most promise. The three men were introduced and told to only ever refer to each other with the nicknames Zhang Jun gave them. Chen Shiqing would keep the name Liu Millions, Li Zejun would be known as Li Zong or Manager Li, and Zhao Zhenghong became Zhao Jingli, General Manager Zhao. The men would refer to Zhang Jun only as President Jiang. In that first meeting, Zhang Jun made it clear to Chen Shiqing and Zhao Zhenghong how far he was willing to go, and asked the three men if they were prepared to take someone's life. The trio all said they had no issues about that, and it wouldn't be long until Zhang Jun would put their claim to the test. In the September of 1998, Zhang Jun told Yang Mingyan to visit him in Changde, and he took her to have a holiday in the Hubei city, Wuhan. While touring the city, the couple walked into the Wuhan Plaza department store. As they entered the jewelry department, the eyes of Zhang Jun lit up. It was twice the size of that of the one in Changsha, giving him his next target. He got the gang together, informing them they were going to do a job soon, and began putting them through their paces. Again, he purchased display cases and had them practice forcing them open and emptying the trays, but the biggest test was yet to come. On October 19, 1998, Zhang Jun approached 19-year-old Wang Zhigang in a labor market for job seekers with the offer of work, saying he needed a cook in his factory and was offering 500 yuan, $60 a month, more than most factories at the time. Looking at Zhang Jun and taking him for a successful businessman from the way he dressed, Wang Zhigang accepted the offer, and followed Zhang Jun to a car being driven by Chen Shiqing. Along the way, they picked up Li Zejun and Zhao Zhenghong, who were waiting for them at a nearby bus station. They drove into the Hanshou County countryside on the outskirts of Changde. Zhang Jun eventually told Chen Shiqing to stop the car and pointed his pistol at Wang Zhigang, telling him to get out of the vehicle and to not try running away or shouting for help. The young man was ordered to strip naked by Zhang Jun, who then told Zhao Zhenghong and Li Zejun to bind the hostage's hands and legs with rope. Li Zejun then placed a plastic bag over the head of Wang Zhigang, which Zhao Zhenghong sealed with tape around the neck. Chen Shiqing held the young man's legs as he struggled to break free. Zhang Jun then told Zhao Zhenghong to choke their victim. Zhao Zhenghong squeezed the throat of Wang Zhigang until he stopped moving and appeared to have stopped breathing. Zhang Jun then handed a hammer to Li Zejun, telling him to make sure the job was done. They then emptied the victim's pockets, taking any money he had, along with his identity card, which would be later found in one of the safes in an apartment Zhang Jun used. After it was done, Zhang Jun made it clear to the others that they'd all played a part in the homicide of Wang Zhigang, and if they ever betrayed him to the police or anyone else, he'd make sure they'd be facing the death penalty alongside him. Zhang Jun took further steps to ensure the other men in the gang would think twice before betraying him. Each man was told to write and sign statements saying they joined him willingly and were fully aware of what they were getting into. The men signed the statements, committing themselves to whatever Zhang Jun planned for the future. Zhang Jun spent the next weeks planning out the robbery in Wuhan, poring over maps of the city, studying the geography, and looking for escape routes from the crime scene. One thing he didn't have was a safe house to use as a base, and place to stash the goods. To solve the issue, he called Qin Zhibi and told her to come to Changde. Arriving in Changde, Qin Zhibi was handed 50,000 yuan, 6,000 USD, and told to head to Hubei and rent an empty storefront with an apartment, from which she could start her own small business in Wuhan. One thing Chongqing is famous around the country for is its oily and very spicy hot pots, and Qin Zhibi decided that starting a Chongqing hot pot restaurant was a natural choice for a native of that city. In Wuhan, she rented a place not far from the scene of the proposed robbery. To ensure the new business didn't receive too many customers, and therefore too many potential witnesses to recognize the men in the aftermath of the robbery, she only hired older, less attractive waitresses, and put her prices slightly higher than other nearby restaurants. Zhang Jun once more contacted Wang Yu, telling him he needed 4 more fake identity cards, and wanted them stating the 4 men came from the northeastern province, Liaoning. Now there were 4 members of the team, some of whom had driving experience. Zhang Jun decided to get a car rather than using motorbikes to get away from the crime scene. He also decided stealing one was a good chance to continue testing the other men and initiating Wang Yu. On December 18, 1998, Zhang Jun and Zhao Zhenghong tested their newly received Liaoning identity cards, checking into a hotel in Changsha. The following evening, they entered a taxi waiting outside the hotel being driven by 40-year-old Kuang Yueliang. Zhang Jun told the driver to head to Li County, on the outskirts of Changde. As the taxi made its way along the quiet countryside roads, Zhang Jun eventually told the driver to stop the car. He then pulled out his pistol and ordered Kuang Yueliang to get into the back seat. The driver did as ordered, and Zhang Jun suddenly ended his life with a single shot to the head. He then turned to Zhao Zhenghong to judge his reaction, and saw the man remain stoic. They stuffed the body into the trunk and drove the taxi to meet up with Li Zejun, Chen Shiqing and Wang Yu, who'd come to Changde to deliver the fake identity cards personally and was subsequently invited to stay in Changde and hang out with them. They drove to a pre-arranged meeting place, where the other men were waiting with bags and disinfectant. Once Zhang Jun and Zhao Zhenghong pulled up, the gang got to work, removing the body from the trunk, much to the shock of Wang Yu. They stripped the body of Kuang Yueliang, removing the man's wallet, keeping any cash in his identity card before making attempts to clean the blood soaking the back seat. Wang Yu watched on, stunned by how casually the other men were treating the situation. Since arriving in Changde, he'd been told how the gang intended to make money, but didn't realize what they were prepared to do. Cleaning the blood proved more difficult than expected, and they decided to continue driving and try to deal with it once they got back to Changde. The men got back in the car, which smelled of a strange mix of disinfectant and blood, leaving the body of Kuang Yueliang to rot in the wilderness. They ended up driving into Hubei and saw they were approaching a toll booth. Knowing that 5 men sat in a car that smelled the way it did would likely set off suspicions, the taxi sped through the checkpoint without stopping. However, there was a police checkpoint only 2 kilometers further down the road, who were contacted by the toll booth staff. Police at the checkpoint waved the car to pull over as it slowly approached. After dumping the body of Kuang Yueliang, the plan was to head into the hills and have the men practice shooting, so they were all armed, except the oblivious Wang Yu. Not wanting the approaching police officer to get close to the car, Zhang Jun got out with the fake identity cards, telling the others to be prepared, and handed them over to Officer Wen Jing. Wen Jing took the documents and began walking to the small police office to inspect them. As the man's back was turned, Zhang Jun pulled out his pistol and fired, ending the police officer's life. Almost as soon as the body of Wen Jing hit the floor, Li Zejun began firing on the officer from the back seat of the car, forcing the other officers on duty to take cover, giving Zhang Jun the opportunity to retrieve the identity cards and get back to the vehicle. The taxi turned round and began making its way back to the more familiar territory of Hunan, and once again approached the toll booth. Seeing the car return, the assistant manager, Zhou Xianlin, stepped into the road to stop them. Zhang Jun leaned out of the window and fired, hitting the man several times, causing severe injuries from which Zhou Xianlin would pass away 2 days later in hospital. Getting back to Changde, the car now worthless, the gang torched it. Wang Yu, almost traumatized by what he'd just witnessed, begged Zhang Jun not to contact him anymore, and said he wanted nothing to do with the gang. Zhang Jun accepted this, but warned Wang Yu he had been involved with the deaths of 3 people, one a police officer, so if he went to the authorities, he and the others would make sure Wang Yu would also be facing the death penalty, as well as reminding Wang Yu that he knew his family and where they lived. After the incident, the gang went to ground, returning to their homes and carrying on their day jobs as Zhang Jun mulled over postponing the robbery, but soon changed his mind on another visit to the city of Wuhan. He went to visit Qin Zhibi to check on how the safe house operation was going, and paid a visit to the Target department store. The ever-reliable Qin Zhibi was doing a good job of running her slightly overpriced Chongqing hot pot restaurant and had everything in place in the apartment above the store. When Zhang Jun visited the mall, he noticed advertising for an upcoming promotional event being held in the jewelry department, meaning there would likely be significantly more goods on site. So he immediately called the other men and ordered them to drop everything and come to Wuhan. Li Zejun, Chen Shiqing and Zhao Zhenghong arrived in the city a few days later, ready to get to work. The gang each checked into different hotels using the fake identity cards, coming to the hot pot restaurant to plan the robbery. It was made clear what each man's role would be. Zhang Jun and Zhao Zhenghong would be crowd control, with Li Zejun and Chen Shiqing grabbing the goods. They also visited the department store, getting familiar with the layout and assessing the store's security. In the early evening of January 4, 1999, the 4 men hailed a taxi and told the driver to take them to an area near Wuhan Square department store. Once the car came to a stop, Zhang Jun pulled out a fake police identity card and told the driver they were undercover and needed to commandeer his vehicle. The skeptical driver hesitated for a moment until Zhang Jun pointed a pistol in his face. They drove the cab to the department store, stopping outside the entrance to an underground parking lot. The men then put on wigs, baseball caps, and pulled masks up over their faces. Seeing the taxi blocking the entrance to the car park, a security guard approached, intending to ask them to move. Noticing the men wearing masks, before seeing the weapon being pointed at him by Li Zejun, the security guard instinctively ducked down, causing the shot fired by Li Zejun to only graze his head. The gang exited the car and headed to the department store entrance. Another security guard who heard the shot and saw his colleague hit the floor tried to pull down the shutter door. Zhao Zhenghong fired, hitting the man, who'd later recover from the injuries sustained. At 7 p.m., the gang entered the jewelry department, weapons raised, shouting for people to get down. Zhang Jun had chosen this time, as it was getting close to closing, so there'd be fewer people around. As staff hit the floor, the few remaining shoppers began to flee. The injured security guards outside had radioed the police to inform them there was a robbery taking place. As Zhang Jun and Zhao Zhenghong kept watch, Li Zejun began prizing display cases open with Chen Shiqing bagging items. A newspaper photographer who'd been there to cover the promotional event saw the unfolding robbery and quickly snapped photos of what was taking place. Zhang Jun noticed and fired at the man, missing him by a few inches. The photographer fled to safety, along with other shoppers startled by the noise, calling the police and his newspaper editor. After a few minutes, Zhang Jun shouted for the men to withdraw. Li Zejun, Chen Shiqing, and Zhao Zhenghong each grabbed a full bag and headed back to the door they used to enter. Outside, other security guards, alerted by the radio reports of the robbery, were checking on their 2 injured colleagues, taking note of the taxi's license plate, and throwing bicycles in the road in an attempt to block the gang's escape route. Leaving the mall, the gang noticed and started firing on the guards, forcing them to take cover. They headed towards the taxi as two armed patrol police officers arrived and began firing, using pillars to the car park's entrance as cover. Hiding behind the taxi, the gang returned fire. Truck driver Wang Xiaoming had pulled up outside the department store just as the police arrived at the scene and was caught in the crossfire. Zhang Jun moved towards the truck, and pulling open the driver's side door, fired at Wang Xiaoming, hitting him in the stomach at point-blank range. He pulled Wang Xiaoming out of the truck's cab before climbing in, then fired on the police through the open passenger side window. He hit both officers, one in the hand and the other, Fang Liang, in the head. With both officers injured, the gang got in the taxi and took their chance to escape, as more police sirens could be heard in the distance. Getting to a predetermined location down a quiet side road, the gang began transferring their loot into other bags and quickly removed the items they wore to hide their identities. They then walked onto the main road, flagging down another taxi. Driver Zhang Jun was unfortunate enough to spot them and stopped his cab to pick them up. Zhang Jun pointed his weapon at the man, telling him to get out of the vehicle, but the driver refused. Zhang Jun pulled the driver's door open and fired at him, hitting Zhang Jun 3 times before dragging him out of the cab and leaving him bleeding on the road. A safe distance away from the scene, the taxi came to a stop. Zhang Jun handed the other men a stack of cash and told them to leave the area individually, but not go straight home, ordering them to make sure they visited several cities along the way, checking into hotels for a few days in each city before moving on, then returning to Changde. Zhang Jun himself planned to go back to the hot pot restaurant where Qin Zhibi and Yang Mingyan were waiting. The robbery ended with 1 dead and 5 injured. Truck driver Wang Xiaoming would prove to be the only casualty. Police officer Fang Liang, despite receiving a bullet to the head, would go on to survive, as would taxi driver Zhang Jun, although both men suffered life-changing injuries. The other wounded men were fortunate to come away with relatively minor wounds. The taxi driver Zhang Jun was left a paraplegic, his injuries confining him to a wheelchair for the rest of his life, and needing his wife to take care of him full-time. After undergoing emergency brain surgery, police officer Fang Liang spent 49 days in a coma. He'd suffered irreparable brain damage, leaving him with the mental age of a child and experiencing frequent epileptic seizures. This would prove to be the biggest robbery masterminded by Zhang Jun thus far. The gang had escaped with 30,000 yuan, $3,600 USD in cash, along with jewelry worth 2.6 million yuan, 315,000 USD. After the robbery in Changsha, Zhang Jun had come to believe that the more dangerous the location appeared, the safer it actually was. He'd noted the Changsha police assumed the men who'd robbed the Friendship Mall would attempt to leave the area and focused the search on all routes out of the city, while he calmly stayed in Changsha for days after. In Wuhan, it would prove to be the same. Police believed the gang would flee the city together. Zhang Jun felt the last place police would look for a suspect would be a small hot pot restaurant a few hundred meters from the crime scene, and even if they did, he had people to vouch for his whereabouts, Qin Zhibi and Yang Mingyan. He'd prearranged to meet Qin Zhibi to help him carry the bags of the loot, and when he arrived at the agreed location only a few meters from the department store, she was already there, both of them hearing the police sirens at the crime scene. Walking through the streets as if they were just a happy couple coming back from a shopping trip, they returned to the restaurant, and Yang Mingyan, who'd been managing the place in the absence of Qin Zhibi, who she now referred to as her aunt. Once safely back in the hideout, Zhang Jun removed his clothes, and Qin Zhibi told Yang Mingyan to cut them up, along with the mask, gloves, and cap Zhang Jun wore during the robbery, which Qin Zhibi later disposed of by burning them in the restaurant's kitchen. In the weeks after the robbery, again following media reports in the newspapers and on television, Zhang Jun saw the police had released descriptions of the suspects and the photos taken at the scene. They also offered a reward of 200,000 yuan, 24,000 USD for information leading to an arrest. He decided it was time to leave the area. He handed Yang Mingyan some of the cash, then told her to head back to Chongqing. He then gave Qin Zhibi 85,000 yuan, over 10,000 USD for her work, telling her to keep the restaurant open for a few more months before closing it down. After leaving Wuhan, he returned to Changde for a while, and eventually got in contact with his men to give them their share of the spoils. Zhang Jun never considered the gang an equal partnership. He personally invested capital into the schemes, covering travel costs, paying for equipment, and renting accommodation, so he viewed the others as employees and paid them performance-based salaries. In this case, Chen Shiqing was handed 80,000 yuan, just under 10,000 USD, which he was more than happy with. Zhao Zhenghong expected to receive the same amount, but during the escape from the department store, he dropped his firearm, which was later found by police. For this he was fined, and only received 50,000 yuan, 6,000 USD. Despite Li Zejun being the closest to him, Zhang Jun frequently treated his nephew harsher than the others. Li Zejun had been told he'd receive 150,000 yuan, 18,000 USD, if the robbery was successful. However, when handing out payments, Zhang Jun once again fined his nephew for a small mistake made in the days leading up to the robbery. This was the second time he'd done something to displease his uncle, and was handed only a fifth of what was promised. The first time he was fined, Li Zejun accepted the punishment, but this time it angered him. However, knowing how ruthless his uncle could be, he knew better than to voice his displeasure. Getting the full value for the stolen gold and silver became increasingly more difficult. Zhang Jun could only really sell to others in the criminal underworld, and with buyers knowing the stuff was stolen and that Zhang Jun had few other options to get money for it, he was forced to accept undervalued offers. He decided that going after cash would see him able to get the full value of what he stole, and chose his next target as a bank, this time going after a cash truck. However, the work would be considerably more dangerous. Unlike security guards in department stores, the escort teams were heavily armed and knew how to use their weapons. Furthermore, he had little knowledge of the inner workings of banks and needed to learn more about them. Knowing one person who could possibly help him, Zhang Jun headed back to Changde to get in contact with his old school friend, who once loaned him 2,000 yuan which he didn't pay back, Xu Jun. Arriving back in the city, he wanted to spend some time enjoying himself before meeting with Xu Jun, and contacted Li Jisheng. Wanting to establish a safe house in Changde, Zhang Jun had thus far failed to find a suitable woman who had her own apartment. Picking him up, Li Jisheng drove Zhang Jun to the hotel he used for massages, to see his regular woman whom he believed could prove useful. That changed when she introduced him to her friend and colleague Chen Le, who instantly caught the attention of Zhang Jun. Like Zhang Jun, Chen Le had lost a parent when she was a child, her father passing away from leukemia. Her mother then struggled to provide for the family working on farms. Wanting to help her mother, Chen Le left school at the age of 16, and like many other young people who didn't finish education, headed south to find factory work in various cities around the provinces of Guangxi and Guangdong. After years away, she eventually grew homesick and decided to return to Changde, and found the best paying work for someone who didn't finish high school was that of working as a hotel massage girl. Along with being attracted to the young woman, Zhang Jun felt she was somewhat naive and easy to manipulate. While she didn't have her own apartment and was living with her sister and brother-in-law, it was easy enough for Zhang Jun to remedy that. Believing him to be a successful businessman by the name of Chen Qiang, Chen Le soon succumbed to his charms and became his final mistress. Xu Jun had followed in his father's footsteps and worked alongside him in the same bank. When Zhang Jun met him for the first time in 12 years, it was under the guise of getting another loan. Neither man mentioned the unpaid debt between them, Xu Jun not sure if his old school friend even remembered it, but he certainly did. Zhang Jun spent much of the conversation asking questions about how banks operated, and Xu Jun had a good idea about the reason for his interest. Rumors had been swirling around the old hometown about how Zhang Jun made money, and now he was asking about cash delivery trucks and bank vaults. It confirmed to Xu Jun that they were more than just rumors. Xu Jun answered the questions, even going so far as to draw a diagram of the vault in his own place of employment. Now he was sure about the rumors being true. Xu Jun was ready to call in the debt when the time was right. Zhang Jun returned to Chongqing, asking Li Jinsheng to drive him the 600-kilometer journey and invited him to spend a few days in the city to enjoy what Chongqing had to offer. The fat man gladly accepted the invitation, with Zhang Jun picking up the bill for his stay. Zhang Jun was trying to pull Li Jinsheng further into the gang, but thus far he'd found it difficult to get Li Jinsheng to agree to working with him more closely. In the May of the year 2000, Li Zejun and Zhao Zhenghong came to Chongqing on the orders of Zhang Jun to hear the plan for the next job. Chen Shiqing had recently been in some separate legal issues, being detained after hospitalizing his neighbor during a dispute, so Zhang Jun initially felt uncomfortable using him for the job. However, he changed his mind when talking with the man. After being told they were next going to target a bank, Zhao Zhenghong appeared more nervous than he had previously. Zhao Zhenghong had already made a major mistake in the previous robbery, dropping his pistol during the getaway, and seeing his nervousness, Zhang Jun decided to let him sit this one out and called Chen Shiqing. Since returning to Chongqing, Zhang Jun had become a father for the third time, Yang Mingyan having given birth to a daughter. During her pregnancy she'd returned to her hometown, so Zhang Jun spent more time with his other Chongqing women, Quan Hongyan receiving the most attention. It hadn't taken long for Quan Hongyan to figure out how Zhang Jun made money, and surprised him by asking to be an active participant in the gang. Zhang Jun felt since she could drive, he could use her to traffic firearms from the contacts in Yunnan like Nabo. He took her to the area and introduced her to the arms dealers after deciding he'd need more firepower if he was going after a bank. He'd also been in touch with Wang Mofu, his Chongqing police contact, buying body armor for the robbery. He went over the plan with the other men, making it clear that what they planned to do was more dangerous. Li Zejun and Chen Shiqing said they were on board, believing the risks were worth the potentially higher rewards. The next weeks were spent preparing. They already had a target bank, and were studying the route the cash transport vehicles took, along with how the money was handed over. In the morning of June 17th, the cash transport truck pulled up outside a branch of the Chongqing Commercial Bank. Two female cashiers, Zhang Jin and Chen Ying, approached the armed escort, carrying the bank's deposit box. The armed escort officers, Tan Zhengjia and Li Ziwei, stepped out of the vehicle. Sat watching in a taxi across the road, Li Zejun and Chen Shiqing got out and approached the bank, immediately opening fire. Officer Tan Zhengjia was struck 3 times by shots from Li Zejun, while the other officer, Li Ziwei, received bullets to the legs from Chen Shiqing. Inside the taxi, Zhang Jun took out his pistol and fired at the stunned taxi driver Luo Yuhong, ending his life with a single shot to the head, then pushed his body out of the car. The two cashiers tried to run back to the safety of the bank and sound the alarm, but Li Zejun fired at the women. Cashier Zhang Jin was struck by a bullet to the head, ending her life instantly. As Li Zejun went to pick up the drop deposit box containing the cash, he found himself being attacked by the other female cashier, Chen Ying, who'd armed herself with a stick from the side of the road. He fired at her and Chen Ying fell to the floor. Li Zejun and Chen Shiqing ran back to the taxi and awaiting Zhang Jun with the deposit box, and the men disappeared into the city. Cashier Zhang Jin and taxi driver Luo Yuhong died at the scene. Tan Zhengjia, Li Ziwei, and Chen Ying later recovered from their injuries. Once in the safe house of Qin Zhibi, the gang were somewhat disappointed to have only gotten away with 140,000 yuan, a little under 17,000 USD. In the aftermath of the robbery, with police out in force, Li Zejun and Chen Shiqing headed back to Changde, and Zhang Jun made his way to Changsha, this time with Quan Hongyan. Since Zhang Jun saw potential use for Quan Hongyan, he was willing to allow her to play an active role in the gang, similar to that of Qin Zhibi. However, he didn't really have anything to hold over her to ensure she couldn't betray him, so he decided to put her to the test and see how far she was willing to go. During their time in Changsha, he showed her how to handle a firearm, and on July 21st they visited one of the city's labor markets. 31-year-old Peng Chenghui was approached by Zhang Jun with the offer of work. The man accepted the job, and Quan Hongyan drove the two men into the countryside of Hanshou County, just as Zhang Jun had with Wang Zhigang 2 years earlier. Returning to the location they left the body of Wang Zhigang, Zhang Jun told Quan Hongyan to stop the car, and ordered Peng Chenghui to get out of the vehicle at gunpoint. Peng Chenghui got down on his knees and Zhang Jun asked Quan Hongyan if she really wanted to do this. She nodded, taking his firearm, then with little hesitation, fired at Peng Chenghui, ending his life. Only a month later, Xu Jun decided it was time to call in the debt, and contacted Zhang Jun. His father had risen to the position of vice president of his bank, with Hu Menglian being the president. Over time, the relationship between the president and vice president became confrontational, and the father of Xu Jun got transferred to another bank under the orders of Hu Menglian. Xu Jun wanted to follow his father, but Hu Menglian refused his request to transfer, and had since forced Xu Jun to wear small shoes, not giving him any opportunities for advancement, punishing Xu Jun for the issues he had with his father. Growing increasingly frustrated and angry with Hu Menglian, Xu Jun decided he wanted the president gone, and Zhang Jun was someone who could help with that. Xu Jun explained the situation to Zhang Jun and brought up the unpaid debt between them. He told Zhang Jun that Hu Menglian frequently boasted about his massive wealth, and Zhang Jun could keep the money as payment for the job. In the evening of August 15, the year 2000, Xu Jun called Hu Menglian to make sure he was in. Moments later, Zhang Jun and Zhao Zhenghong knocked on the door of the bank president's home. Hu Menglian had no time to react before he found a firearm pointing at his face. The two men forced their way into the home, and Zhao Zhenghong got the wife Zhang Yuanzhen under control. Zhang Jun demanded all the money and valuables they had, and Hu Menglian took him to a safe. The safe contained 440,000 yuan, 53,000 USD. Due to the information Xu Jun gave him, Zhang Jun was expecting more, and demanded to know where it was hidden. Hu Menglian took him to where he and his wife kept their jewelry. Zhang Jun noticed that the man's watch was actually worth less than his own. He quickly began to believe that the bank president wasn't as wealthy as Xu Jun claimed. Zhang Jun began beating Hu Menglian, demanding 3 million yuan, the banker saying he didn't have anything close to that, and lied about his wealth to impress other people. Zhang Jun called Li Zejun and Chen Shiqing, who were waiting in the taxi driven by Chen Shiqing, and told them to come to the home. While they waited, the bank president and his wife were tied up. Realizing what Zhang Jun had planned, Hu Menglian started saying he could get them more money, but it would take time. There were processes he had to go through to move the cash through the banking system, but his words fell on deaf ears. Once Li Zejun and Chen Shiqing arrived, the couple were bundled into the back of the vehicle, their hands and legs bound. Chen Shiqing drove out to a quiet area on the banks of the Changde River. Hu Menglian tried to beg for his life and that of his wife, but on seeing the men take shovels out of the back of the car, he knew there was no way out. Pulled into the field, Hu Menglian and Zhang Yuanzhen were forced to get on their knees. Hu Menglian then had his life ruthlessly ended by Zhang Jun, and his wife executed by Zhao Zhenghong. The four men then dug a shallow grave and buried the bodies before calling Xu Jun to inform him the job was done. With the disappointment of not getting as much as he expected from Hu Menglian, Zhang Jun was already planning the next heist, and chose Changde as the location. Both Chen Shiqing and Li Zejun felt concerned about the idea, believing it was too close to home. They had also noticed a worrying change in the mood of the boss. Previously, there had been long periods of inactivity between robberies, ranging from 6 months to a year, but now they were looking at committing 3 major crimes in only 4 months. They got the impression that Zhang Jun was prepared to take more chances because he was desperate for money. Their suspicions were correct. Despite having stolen millions over the past few years, Zhang Jun was not as wealthy as he made out. Buying weapons and other equipment for the robberies was costly, as was keeping his 5 mistresses happy. He was paying for each of their living costs, paying rent on apartments he didn't own, and had bought one in Chongqing, and now in Changde. Furthermore, his general lifestyle had seen his wealth dwindle. He spent much of his free time visiting brothels, dance halls and gambling, hobbies which didn't come cheap. Despite the concerns about their boss, the 2 men felt they had little choice other than to go along with his plan, knowing how ruthless and cold-blooded he could be, and fearing the consequences they'd face if they disobeyed him. With the plan to rob the bank in Changde, Zhang Jun had one major concern, that of the fatman Li Jisheng. Thus far Li Jisheng had been a peripheral figure to the gang. He was the regular driver for Zhang Jun whenever he came to town, and had spent time with him in Chongqing. However, fully pulling him into the gang had proven difficult. Whenever Zhang Jun made an offer of work without saying explicitly what the job was, Li Jisheng had politely turned the offer down, saying he was happy doing his own businesses. Unlike Yan Ruoming, Li Zejun, Chen Shiqing and Zhao Zhenghong, Li Jisheng didn't have money worries, but there was also another reason for his reticence. Li Jisheng wasn't stupid and had long ago realized Zhang Jun was lying about being in the electronic appliance business. While he didn't know the full extent of their crimes, he suspected the men were involved in illegal activity, so kept some degree of separation between himself and the gang. This distance was a concern for Zhang Jun. Now he was planning to do the next job in Changde. While Li Jisheng didn't know any of the gang's real names, people had undoubtedly seen them together, and he knew about Chen Le and the two apartments. Zhang Jun decided he needed to make sure Li Jisheng kept his mouth shut if the police came to him asking questions. In late August, Li Jisheng got a call from Zhang Jun asking him to come and pick him up from a labor market. Shortly after pulling up, Zhang Jun got into the car with 28-year-old Yang Zhengbing, who believed he'd just earned himself a job. Zhang Jun told Li Jisheng he was taking Yang Zhengbing to play mahjong and said they'd be picking up Zhao Zhenghong along the way. Zhang Jun directed him where to go after Zhao Zhenghong joined them, Li Zejun and Chen Shiqing following in another car behind, unbeknownst to Li Jisheng. Zhang Jun told Li Jisheng to stop once they reached the place the bodies of Hu Menglian and Zhang Yuanzhen were buried. Zhang Jun told Li Jisheng he knew too much and he needed to prove he could trust him. He and Zhao Zhenghong pulled out their weapons and told the other men to get out of the car. They walked down to the side of the river, being joined by Chen Shiqing carrying shovels and an armed Li Zejun. Li Jisheng pleaded with Zhang Jun to be reasonable, saying he was a trustworthy person, while Yang Zhengbing begged for his life. Li Jisheng was handed a pistol and told to end the life of Yang Zhengbing. Looking around at the faces of the other men, Li Jisheng understood if they didn't leave one body behind, they'd be leaving two. Out of self-preservation, he fired at Yang Zhengbing, ending the man's life. The robbery was planned to take place on September 1st, and the day before Zhang Jun, Li Zejun and Zhao Zhenghong got into a taxi being driven by Wang Jiyong with the intention of stealing the man's vehicle. They returned to the same area where they'd already buried 3 bodies, meeting the waiting Chen Shiqing, and told the driver they were going to take his taxi. Wang Jiyong was ordered to exit the vehicle with a pistol pointed to his head, but before getting out, managed to hit an ignition kill switch the car had installed. Many taxi drivers at the time would use such devices to prevent their cars being stolen. Zhao Zhenghong sat in the driver's seat and found he was unable to start the car. The gang demanded to know what the problem was, but driver Wang Jiyong played dumb, acting as if it was an issue with the engine. Being a taxi driver himself and suspecting he knew what was wrong, Chen Shiqing began looking for the kill switch. The gang distracted, Wang Jiyong took the opportunity to escape and ran for his life. Zhang Jun gave chase but was too slow to catch the younger man. He stopped and fired, hitting Wang Jiyong in the back. He then approached the man and finished him off with a bullet to the head. They took the body of Wang Jiyong back to the vehicle and stuffed it in the trunk before trying to get the car started. However, no matter what they tried, the engine refused to come to life. While they were struggling to get the car started, they were approached by Zhang Lulin to see if they needed help, but he was abruptly told to get lost. The taxi now useless to them, they abandoned it, with the body in the trunk, deciding not to waste time burying it. The next evening the gang got into the taxi of Liu Hui and told the driver to head to the bank. Arriving a few minutes before the cash transport truck, Li Zejun, Chen Shiqing and Zhao Zhenghong got out, Zhang Jun staying inside telling the driver he was waiting for a friend. Once the truck arrived, Zhao Zhenghong and Li Zejun took out the armed escort guards Xiao Weidong, Wang Jianguo and Zhou Jun, then collected their weapons, with Chen Shiqing going inside to the cashiers. While this was going on, Zhang Jun ended the life of Liu Hui, before pulling his body out of the vehicle. Zhao Zhenghong joined Chen Shiqing, both men firing on Wang Pingtou and Li Jing before taking the keys to the truck. However, Zhao Zhenghong couldn't find the right key, eventually snapping one off in the lock. The gang retreated to the taxi, firing on the gathering crowd, and began making their escape, the final victim, Meng Qingzhong, having his life ended by Zhang Jun as they made their getaway. With most of the gang and their associates now in custody, the teams investigating the case set about tracking down the last man standing, Chen Shiqing. Thus far, the ability of Chen Shiqing to evade capture had been down to blind luck, and to some degree the Changde police being one step ahead of him. He'd first gone back to his home and told his wife to go to Guangdong province with the children and stay with family there. Then on September 5th, he arrived at the home of Zhao Zhenghong, just hours after his arrest. Neighbors told Chen Shiqing about what had happened earlier, so he decided to find Zhang Jun. Correctly thinking Zhang Jun would head to Chongqing to hide out, Chen Shiqing slowly made his way to the city, taking small back roads to avoid police roadblocks and checkpoints. However, by the time he arrived in the city, Zhang Jun was already in police custody, and news of the arrest was all over the media. Chen Shiqing quickly left the city and headed into the mountainous countryside outside of Chongqing to hide out in small villages, trying to figure out his next move. He remained in contact with family members, but soon found out his wife had been detained and was being questioned about his whereabouts. Not wanting to cause his wife and children any problems, he decided to turn himself in. Just over a month after the robbery in Changde, a combination of armed police officers and military arrived in the small village and arrested Chen Shiqing. He was transported back to Chongqing to be interrogated, where he confessed to his crimes. With the gang now all in custody, several more arrests would be made in Yunnan province, with Napo and other people who sold firearms to Zhang Jun being hunted down. More arrests were made in Chongqing. Corrupt detective Wang Moufu was named by Zhang Jun, along with officer Yang Mingjun, the brother of Yang Mingyan, who'd also been supplying the gang with equipment. During interrogations, the people arrested would all confess to at least some involvement with the gang in the robberies, but many tried to play down their level of participation while not hesitating to put more blame on other members. Zhao Zhenghong admitted to playing a role in the various crimes, but denied ending anyone's life, and even ever having fired a weapon. However, his claims were directly contradicted by Li Zejun, Chen Shiqing, and Zhang Jun. Li Zejun made a similar claim, admitting to firing his weapon, but only as warning shots, never actually injuring anyone. Again, this was contradicted by other members of the gang, who testified they'd seen him ruthlessly end people's lives. Xu Jun retracted his confession about conspiring in the Hu Menglian case, blaming it on a nervous breakdown after his arrest, but again testimony from others involved said different. Others, notably Chen Le and Yan Min, claimed they were coerced into participating, either being threatened with death or the deaths of their family by Zhang Jun. The investigation continued for a further 7 months, as police went through the evidence they'd collected, and in the April of 2001, 18 people would face trial for their involvement in multiple crimes. However, a dispute would break out over where the trial would be held. The Changde police and lead investigator Yang Bingquan had done the majority of the work in bringing the gang to justice, and the main members all hailed from the local jurisdiction. He believed the trial should be held in Changde, but this was disputed by the Chongqing authorities and Wenqiang in particular. Since the arrest of Zhang Jun, Wenqiang had made many media appearances proclaiming himself the person who finally cracked the case by bringing Zhang Jun to justice, and demanded that the trial take place in Chongqing. Police in Changde felt the demands of Wenqiang were largely down to him wanting to raise his own public profile, thus furthering his personal political ambitions. In the end, the decision was made to hold 2 trials. Most of those arrested in Hunan, along with Chen Shiqing, would be tried in Changde, while the others would face justice in Chongqing, including the biggest prize Zhang Jun. While the gang were held in custody awaiting the trial, they were appointed a defense team, who began working on how best to defend their clients. The evidence investigators collected combined with each gang member's individual testimony left no doubt about their guilt, but there was still a question over their level of participation and their sentences. Most of those Zhang Jun convinced to join him were vulnerable people, either having severe money troubles or having gone through other personal problems. Furthermore, many of the accused testified that Zhang Jun threatened them with death and the deaths of their families if they disobeyed him in any way. The defense team argued that the accused took part in the criminal acts through coercion and blackmail, in attempts to help their clients avoid the death penalty. While the others were trying to avoid the inevitable, Zhang Jun knew there was no way out for him, and had accepted his fate. He confessed to the crimes he committed, but initially refused to give much detail about them.
上海疑的是不是？杀刑把有的商店抢钱是不是你干的？是我干的。还有谁？就是还有哪里的案子是不是？不是，杀刑把有的商店抢钱案，又同谁干的？是一个女的。
While admitting his own guilt, he somewhat surprisingly wouldn't give the names of the other people who worked with him. The prosecution wanted more information from him to help punish the right people involved. However, facing the death penalty, there was little reason for Zhang Jun to talk. In efforts to get more out of him, the prison was ordered to grant him special privileges. He was given a private cell with a television set, allowed to choose his own meals, given the time to speak with his sons on the phone, and even had a birthday celebration with other inmates. The bribery worked, and Zhang Jun talked, giving police detailed information about his life and crimes, along with plans for ones he never got the chance to do, which included blowing up a bank vault and kidnapping a government official. On April 14, 2001, the trials in Changde and Chongqing began. An estimated 10,000 people gathered outside the courtroom in Chongqing as people tried to get a seat in the public gallery. In both cities, extra security was needed outside the courts, police fearing relatives of the victims may attempt to exact their own justice on the accused. The trials lasted 2 days, with the defendants being found guilty of all charges put before them, and on April 21 they heard their sentences. Arms dealer Na Po and 3 others who sold weapons and ammunition to the gang were sentenced to death. Corrupt police officers Wang Moufu and brother of Yang Mingyan, Wang Mingjun, were both sentenced to life in prison. Yan Ruoming was sentenced to death for participating in 2 robberies which ultimately caused the deaths of 2 people and leaving several others severely wounded. His brother-in-law Wang Yu was also handed the death penalty for contributing to the deaths of 3 people. While he didn't take a direct role in the homicides, his not coming forward after the fact caused many more people to lose their lives. It was a similar story for Li Jinsheng. He was sentenced to death for intentional homicide, and while the court accepted he only acted under extreme coercion, not coming forward after the incident contributed to more people dying. Despite retracting his confession, there was too much evidence against Xu Jun, and he was sentenced to death for conspiracy to commit homicide. Yan Min received the death penalty for her role in the robbery, ending with the death of Li Jiuchuan and several other charges. Yang Mingyan was also handed the death penalty, however it came with a 2-year suspension, the sentence later being commuted to life in prison. For her very active participation in the gang's activities, Qin Zhibi was sentenced to death. However, her execution would be delayed as she was in the process of suing several media outlets. Her legal action was to help restore her daughter's reputation. After her arrest, newspaper reports claimed her daughter also had an intimate relationship with Zhang Jun, which was completely false. Her case was successful and the story was retracted, with the daughter of Qin Zhibi receiving compensation for the damage done to her reputation. The only member of the Pink Army to directly end someone's life, Quan Hongyan, received the death penalty for her actions. Chen Le was the only woman to escape being severely punished. She knew little about the activities of Zhang Jun, and still didn't know his real name at the time of her arrest. She would be sentenced to 9 years in prison for harboring a criminal. Zhao Zhenghong, Chen Shiqing and Li Zejun, found guilty of multiple intentional homicides, armed robbery, kidnapping, and trafficking firearms, were sentenced to death, with all their personal property being confiscated. Finally and inevitably, Zhang Jun was handed the death penalty for his near-decade-long criminal career. After hearing his punishment, he only asked that his execution take place soon. After hearing their fates, several of the gang appealed their sentences, but they were swiftly turned down. On May 20, 2001, the condemned criminals were taken to the execution ground to face their punishment and were executed by firing squad. Just prior to his execution, Zhang Jun received some good news. The daughter he'd had with Yang Mingyan had a new home, being legally adopted by his ex-wife Xiao Yue'e. With the young girl's parents both being convicted of multiple crimes, she was effectively left an orphan, the family of Yang Mingyan seemingly not interested in taking care of her, given who her father was. Xiao Yue'e offered to look after the girl and raise her along with her half-brothers, while she attempted to avoid the media glare in an effort to protect her sons from public scrutiny. There were genuine fears that if the boys' identities became public knowledge, then their lives could be in danger, from victims' relatives looking for revenge. Gag orders were placed on the media to prevent them from exposing the names of the children, who eventually got new identities. It appeared that Xiao Yue'e proved to be a good mother when she gave an interview years after the execution of Zhang Jun. Both her sons graduated from university, and the daughter was likely to get into college herself. Due to the notoriety of the case in China, several pieces of media have used it as inspiration for their stories. The most recent and perhaps most notable is the 2020 movie, 除暴, which has the English name Caught in Time. In the aftermath of the case, both police forces were highly praised for the work done in bringing the gang to justice, both Yang Bingquan in Changde and Wen Qiang in Chongqing receiving awards for their efforts. Wen Qiang in particular saw his career go from strength to strength, as he gained increasingly more powerful positions. However, almost a decade after arresting Zhang Jun in 2009, Wen Qiang found himself in court facing the death penalty. He was facing charges of bribery, corruption, acting as a protective umbrella for numerous organized criminal gangs in Chongqing, and violating multiple female victims, some of them middle school girls. But that's a story for another video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like, leaving a comment and subscribing to the channel. And hope to see you again for the next dark tale from the Middle Kingdom.